I took the trip in late September of 2022. The summer crowds had already thinned out, and the weather was starting to cool down in the hills around northern Idaho. I was 31, single, and had just finished a long-term project at work that burned me out completely. I had no desire to be around people for a while, no interest in going out drinking or talking to anyone about how stressed I was. I just wanted quiet, real, thick silence. I wanted to feel the world without all the noise we wrap around ourselves every day. I packed up my black Tacoma with all the gear I'd need: tent, food, stove, water filter, first aid kit, knife, bear spray, clothes, boots, fire starter, backup everything. I made a list and checked it twice because I didn't want to end up halfway up a mountain and realize I'd forgotten something basic like matches. I wasn't new to this kind of trip. I'd done a lot of solo hiking and camping in my 20s, mostly in the Colorado backcountry. But this would be the longest solo trip I'd taken in a while. For nights, 5 days, no reception, no people, just me and the woods. I picked a spot in the Panhandle National Forest, up near the Montana border. It wasn't a well-known trail. I found it on a forum where a guy mentioned it in a comment from a few years back. He said the lake up there was cold and clear, and he'd seen nobody for 3 full days. That was all I needed to hear. I parked on a dirt turnoff about 30 miles east of Sandpoint, checked the lock on my truck, and slung my pack over my shoulders. It was heavier than I remembered from past trips, but I figured I'd adjust after the first mile or two. The first few hours of hiking were smooth, steep at times, but manageable. The trail twisted through dense pine, with patches of birch that rattled their dry leaves when the wind picked up. There was that sharp, clean smell of pine needles and cold dirt, and every now and then I'd catch sight of deer trails or scat. I saw a pile of moose droppings that looked fresh, but I didn't spot any actual animals. I made it to the lake by late afternoon. It sat low in a shallow bowl of rock, half ringed by steep cliffs and thick forest. The water was glassy, dark green, with no sign of algae or trash or even footprints near the shore. I set up my tent on a flat stretch about 30 yards from the lake, near a small outcrop that could break some of the wind. I cleared the ground of pine cones and sticks and got the tent staked in tight. Then I got a fire going. Not a big one, just enough to cook and keep warm when the sun dipped. That first night was peaceful. The temperature dropped fast after sunset, and the sky went from orange to deep blue and then black. I watched the stars come out, ate freeze-dried beef stew from a metal pot, and sat by the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open. I crawled into the tent, zipped up the sleeping bag, and fell asleep to the sound of wind moving through the trees. The next day I spent exploring. I followed a game trail that led up the ridge to the north, climbing until I could see the whole lake from above. It looked even more remote from up there. No tire tracks, no old campsites, no litter, just wilderness. I took a few pictures with my phone, even though I knew I wouldn't be able to send them until I got back. I came back down by early evening and filtered some water from the lake to refill my bottles. The water was cold enough to sting my fingers. That night, something felt off. Not wrong, not dangerous, just off. It started when I was eating. I just finished a packet of chili mac when I heard something move in the trees behind me. Not the wind, not a squirrel. A solid, deliberate snap. A heavy footstep. I stayed completely still and listened. Nothing followed. I waited another 5 minutes, thinking maybe it was a deer that caught my scent. I slowly got up, grabbed my flashlight, and scanned the woods. I didn't see anything. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept waking up thinking I'd heard something. Twigs snapping, movement outside. But each time I unzipped the sleeping bag and sat up to listen, there was only silence. Thick, suffocating silence. The kind that gets inside your ears and makes you feel like you're hearing your own heartbeat. The third day was colder. I stayed close to camp, mostly chopping firewood from a deadfall I'd found and reinforcing the small fire pit with more rocks. Around mid-afternoon, I noticed something strange near the shoreline. On the rocks, about 20 feet from the water, was a long, thin strip of dark fabric. At first, I thought it was mine. Maybe something fell out of my pack. But when I picked it up, it wasn't mine. It looked like a sleeve torn from a jacket, black nylon with a Velcro strap and part of a zipper. It was dirty, but not decayed. not weather-worn. I stared at it for a while, trying to figure out how it got there. I walked the shoreline in both directions. No other signs of gear. No prints, no wrappers, no tools, no other clothes. Just that one sleeve. I took it back to camp and set it near the fire ring. I didn't want to keep it in the tent. That night was worse than the one before. I was nearly asleep when I heard something heavy walk through the brush. Closer this time. Definitely bipedal. I sat up fast and grabbed my flashlight, shining it toward the sound. But again, there was nothing. No eye shine, no movement, just silence after the footsteps stopped. I stayed up most of that night, sitting near the fire with the bear spray in my lap. Every 10 minutes I scanned the woods, shining the light into the trees, checking behind the rocks. I kept the fire going until sunrise. The next morning I made the decision to pack up. I didn't feel right staying another night. I didn't feel scared exactly, just on edge, like something wasn't adding up. I packed quickly and hiked out with more urgency than I had on the way in. I made it back to the truck in the early afternoon, locked the doors behind me, and drove out fast. I didn't tell anyone about the sleeve or the noises, or the way I couldn't shake the feeling that someone, or something, had been watching me for at least 2 nights. I told myself it could have been a hunter, poacher, someone who didn't want to be seen. But there had been no tire tracks near the trailhead, no other camps, no scent of smoke, nothing. A week after I got home, I kept thinking about it. I couldn't shake the image of that jacket sleeve lying on the rocks. I ended up calling the local ranger station. I told them where I'd camped and what I found, and I asked if anyone else had gone missing up there. The guy on the phone paused a second too long before saying no, nothing recent. He thanked me for the report and said they'd send someone to check it out. A few weeks later, I got curious and searched for missing persons cases in northern Idaho. I didn't expect to find anything, but one result made my stomach flip. A hiker named Derek Callahan had gone missing in September 2021, almost exactly a year before I went. His truck had been found parked near a small trailhead east of Sandpoint. He told his brother he was heading to a remote lake in the forest and planned to be out for 3 nights. They never found him. They searched the area for weeks, but no trace turned up. No gear, no camp, no body. The picture they used in the article showed Derek wearing a black nylon jacket. The same kind of jacket the sleeve had come from. I sat there staring at that photo, the hair on my arms standing up. I couldn't breathe for a few seconds. I felt cold. It wasn't just nerves. It was a deep, twisting fear that settled right in my chest. That place, those woods, that lake was where he disappeared, and I had camped in the same exact spot. I must have been only a few yards from where he'd set up. Maybe I was right on top of where he'd vanished. I didn't call the ranger station again. I didn't tell anyone else what I found. I didn't want to deal with the follow-up, the questions, the possibility that I'd brushed right up against something I shouldn't have. I haven't gone camping since. I still go on hikes, but only during the day and only on marked trails with cell reception. No more solo trips. No more remote spots. I gave away most of my gear a few months after I got back. Not because I was scared I'd see something again, but because I knew that if I ever heard those footsteps again out in the trees, I might not get the chance to leave next time. Whatever happened to Derek, it happened quietly, without a scream, without a sign. Just one man alone in the woods who never came back. I was lucky. I know that now, and I'm not interested in pushing my luck a second time. It was late August of 2019 when I decided to take a solo camping trip to disconnect from everything for a few days. I had just turned 33, and after years of working office jobs in Cleveland, I'd finally taken a few weeks off to just be alone. No phone service, no emails, no small talk with coworkers in the kitchen. I needed quiet and I needed space. I drove about 7 hours southeast to Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. I'd been there once before with a friend in college, and I remembered the place being huge, quiet, and thick with woods. I had a map of the forest trails, and I chose a lesser-known one that stretched through the higher elevation parts of the forest. Mostly fir and spruce trees with some rock outcrops and long patches of mossy floor. There were no established campgrounds in that area, which is exactly what I wanted. Just me, my gear, and some peace. I parked my car along a dirt service road, hoisted on my backpack, and began hiking around noon. The trail was thin and a little overgrown in places, but it was clearly visible, and it climbed slowly through the forest. The higher I got, the cooler it became. I passed no one. I saw no cars or signs of fresh footprints. It was exactly what I hoped for, just silence and forest. That first day, I hiked for about 6 miles before settling on a flat spot just off the trail. A little clearing surrounded by spruce trees with some fallen logs that looked like they'd been down for years. I set up my tent, got a small fire going using a fire ring made from rocks nearby, and cooked some food I brought, just instant noodles and some jerky. As the light faded, I sat there staring at the fire, feeling the weight of weeks and months of work slowly peel off. There was something comforting about knowing that no one could reach me, that no one knew exactly where I was. In a way, it felt like I didn't exist for a while, and that was peaceful. That night, I fell asleep fast, tucked in my sleeping bag inside the tent. It was quiet in that way forests get, where the silence becomes so complete, it feels like sound itself has gone to sleep. I didn't even hear any crickets or frogs, just wind now and then brushing the tops of the trees. I woke up at some point in the night and heard a short sound outside, like a crunching noise, like a stick snapping under pressure. I stayed still, listening. It was probably a deer or a raccoon. I was in their world now, after all. After a while, I didn't hear anything else, and I drifted off again. The next morning, I made oatmeal and packed up camp. I planned to hike deeper, then loop back around on the third day. The trail continued upward, winding through dense forest with the occasional break where I could look out over the valley below. I took pictures but didn't check them. My phone was on airplane mode to save battery. By early afternoon, I found another clearing to set up camp. It was smaller than the first but flat and surrounded by dense trees. There were large moss-covered rocks near one edge that looked like they'd been sitting there for centuries. I set up the tent again and gathered some dry sticks for another small fire. The sun filtered through the trees in long rays, and the forest was so still it felt like everything was watching me. But in that neutral way wild places do, like I was just something passing through. That night, I had another simple meal and watched the light drain from the forest. As it got dark, I noticed a faint smell in the air. Something musky, almost like wet dog or damp earth, but sharper. I figured it was just from the moss or maybe a decaying tree stump nearby. I smelled weird things in the woods before. I didn't think much of it. Once it was fully dark, I crawled into the tent and lay in my bag reading a bit with my headlamp. I turned it off after a while and lay still, feeling the air cool down. Again, the silence was deep, but this time it felt heavier, like the silence had weight. I told myself that was just my mind reacting to being alone. Sometime past midnight, I heard a noise again. This time, more than just one. It was a series of soft rustling sounds, like leaves being brushed aside, and then a low thump. Not a twig snap, a thump like something solid hitting the ground. I froze and listened. There were no voices, no lights, just more faint rustling. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing, for a long time. The forest returned to quiet. No footsteps, nothing moving. I told myself again, probably a deer, maybe a black bear. I had food sealed and away from the tent, so nothing should have been too interested. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, stiff and cold. The fire was completely out, and a light mist hung over the ground. That sharp, musky smell was stronger. I looked around the camp and didn't notice anything odd at first. But then, about 20 feet from my tent, I saw a small broken branch in the moss. It looked freshly snapped, light-colored with still exposed. Right next to it was a shallow indent in the moss, like someone or something had stood there recently. I crouched down and touched the moss. It was pressed down. Not a big print, but definitely not natural. No claw marks or boot tread, just a smooth shape. I stood up and looked around, heart picking up a bit. The forest seemed the same. Still, no movement, but I felt different, like something had changed in how the place felt. It was still beautiful, still quiet, but the peace I'd felt before was gone. I packed up quickly and decided to change plans. I'd start heading back instead of looping deeper. I figured I'd find a new camp spot closer to the trailhead. As I hiked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. I didn't hear any birds that morning. No squirrels chattering, just wind and my own footsteps. The trail felt longer than before. I kept checking the map, but it was hard to be sure. There were no markers and I hadn't seen any trail signs in hours. I figured I'd just gotten turned around a little. I still had water, food, and my compass. By late afternoon, I came across a downed tree across the trail. It looked freshly fallen, maybe from a storm days ago. I climbed over it, but as I did, I noticed something strange. A small torn piece of blue fabric caught on a branch. It looked like it came from clothing. It wasn't mine. I hadn't seen anyone out here. That got my nerves going again. Someone else had been through here and not long ago. But I still hadn't seen another person since I parked the car. I kept going. I was hoping to find a good place to camp before dark, but nothing looked right. The woods felt tighter here, the trees growing closer together. I finally found a small spot just off the trail where I could squeeze the tent between two trees and a rock wall. I set up fast and skipped the fire. I wasn't in the mood. I ate a cold meal and sat with my back to the rock as the forest dimmed. I didn't feel good about this spot, but I didn't have much of a choice. It was almost dark. That night was the worst. Around 2 in the morning, I woke up to what I thought was a branch hitting the tent. Then another. I stayed still, eyes wide open in the dark. Then I heard footsteps. Not animal footsteps, human ones. Slow, crunching lightly on the pine needles and twigs. Pacing, then stopping. They were just outside the tent. I held my breath and didn't move. The steps shifted again, circled slowly, then stopped at the side of the tent. Still no sound, no breathing, no voice, just waiting. I stayed frozen, every part of me alert. My heart felt like it would beat out of my chest. I thought about the knife in my pack, but it was outside the bag, near the tent's entrance. Too far to reach without making noise. After what felt like an hour but was probably minutes, the steps faded. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I waited until the first gray light broke through the tent, then got up and packed in under 5 minutes. I didn't even eat. I just hiked. Every little sound behind me made me turn. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. My legs burned. My back hurt, but I didn't stop. By mid-afternoon, I finally saw a familiar marker, one I remembered from the first day. I was within a few miles of the car. I pushed harder, almost jogging with my pack bouncing behind me. I reached the trailhead just as the sun dipped below the hills. My car was there, no one else around. The same spot, no signs of anyone. I tossed my pack in the back, locked the doors, and sat behind the wheel shaking. I waited a few minutes before starting the car. I wanted to calm down enough to drive. As I pulled away, I checked the rearview mirror constantly. Nothing followed. I didn't stop until I reached a gas station about an hour out. I got food, water, and finally checked my phone. No signal. I didn't care. I just needed to see people again. When I got home, I unpacked slowly. I washed everything twice. I didn't talk about the trip. Not for a long time. It took weeks before I stopped checking over my shoulder when walking down the street or going to the store. I don't know who or what was out there with me. Could have been another hiker. Could have been someone living in the woods. Could have been someone who didn't want me there. But it wasn't an animal. That much I know. Whatever the reason, I haven't been camping since. It was late October when I decided to go camping alone in the remote woods of Montana. I had been planning it for months, wanting to disconnect from everything. Work, people, my phone, just me and nature for a few days. The year was 2024, and I was 28 years old. I figured I'd enjoy the solitude and the crisp air, the crunch of fallen leaves underfoot, and the quiet of the forest. It had been a long time since I had time to think without distractions. I drove up to a spot I'd researched online, a campsite tucked away near a quiet lake, far from the usual tourist paths. There was a thin trail that led deeper into the woods from the main path, and that's where I would set up my tent. The weather was turning colder, and the trees were starting to change color. Red, yellow, and orange leaves filled the air with their fiery glow as I made my way to the site. By the time I set up my tent and built a small campfire, the sun had dipped below the horizon. It was getting dark quickly, and I had a moment of hesitation. Something about the quiet seemed too deep, too heavy. The wind wasn't picking up at all, and the stillness in the woods made everything feel as though it was holding its breath. I brushed the feeling aside, convincing myself it was just the isolation getting to me. I pulled a sleeping bag out of my pack and arranged everything for the night. I had enough food for a few days, and I was looking forward to the silence. After all, it wasn't my first solo camping trip, just the first in such an isolated location. Night fell hard. The campfire crackled softly, throwing long shadows across the trees. I had a small book to read, but the eerie silence made it difficult to focus. The only sounds I could hear were the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. I felt my eyelids growing heavy, and soon enough, I decided to head to the tent. I put out the fire and settled into the warmth of my sleeping bag, pulling the hood over my head to block out the cold. I woke up sometime in the night to the feeling that something was wrong. At first, it was a vague discomfort, a sense that I wasn't as alone as I had thought. My heart raced as I listened intently, straining to hear anything that would explain the sudden unease creeping over me. Nothing. The woods were silent again, too silent. I tried to convince myself it was just the dark, my mind playing tricks. But then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something was moving just outside my tent. At first, it was so soft I wasn't sure if I had imagined it. But then the sound came again, louder this time, followed by the unmistakable crunch of leaves underfoot. It was closer than any animal would get, or at least any I knew about. I lay there, motionless, my breath shallow. I listened for a few moments longer, trying to make sense of the noise. It didn't stop, and I could feel my pulse thumping in my ears. My hands were sweating, and I could feel a cold tingle creeping down my spine. Whoever or whatever was out there was moving cautiously, deliberately. It was too calculated to be an animal. It didn't feel right. I tried to tell myself it was nothing, but my instincts told me otherwise. I grabbed my flashlight and turned it on, then pressed my ear against the fabric of the tent, trying to hear more clearly. The rustling continued, now accompanied by a faint, almost imperceptible scraping sound. It was the kind of noise that made your skin crawl. I couldn't take it any longer. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just a little to peek outside. I scanned the area with the flashlight, but everything was still. The beam of light danced across the trees, the ground, the pile of fallen leaves. Nothing. No sign of anyone. My heart slowed slightly, but the sense of unease didn't dissipate. If anything, it deepened. I lay back down, still clutching the flashlight in my hand, not daring to close my eyes. The forest was too quiet. It had always been too quiet for my liking. The rest of the night passed slowly. I heard the rustling intermittently, but nothing appeared. No figures, no movement beyond the occasional rustle of leaves. When the first light of dawn began to filter through the trees, I felt a strange sense of relief. Maybe I had just been imagining things, or maybe it was the wind playing tricks on me. The air was damp and cold, but the first light made everything seem less threatening. I packed up my camp quickly that morning, eager to leave the uneasy feeling behind. As I was rolling up my tent, I noticed something strange. There were footprints around my camp. At first, I thought it was just the usual marks from animals moving through the area, but then I saw the distinct shape of a human footprint in the mud near the edge of the campsite. The prints were fresh, too fresh to be from the previous night. My heart skipped a beat as I realized someone had been watching me. The tracks led off into the woods, disappearing into the thicket. I took a step back, my hands shaking. I debated leaving right then and there, but the rational part of my brain told me I was being paranoid. Maybe someone else was camping nearby, and I hadn't noticed them. But deep down, I knew it wasn't that simple. I felt sick to my stomach at the thought of someone being so close to my tent without me noticing. Against my better judgment, I followed the tracks. They weren't difficult to find, the mud was soft, and the leaves had been disturbed recently. I wasn't sure what I was expecting to find, but I needed answers, needed to understand what had happened the night before. The prints led me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew denser and the sunlight barely broke through the canopy. It wasn't long before the tracks led me to a small clearing. In the center of the clearing was a pile of old branches and leaves, half buried in the ground. At first, I didn't notice anything strange, but then I saw it. A small, worn backpack tucked under the branches. My stomach dropped. The backpack was covered in dirt, its zipper half open. I approached cautiously, my breath caught in my throat. I kneeled beside it, my hands trembling as I reached for it. The bag felt surprisingly light. I opened the zipper and pulled out a few items: some food wrappers, a small pocket knife, and a few scattered pieces of cloth. But it was the last thing I found that made my heart stop. A torn photograph. It was of a man, maybe in his late 30s, standing in front of a cabin. The cabin looked old, abandoned, but the man's eyes seemed eerily familiar. I couldn't place it at first, but then it hit me. Those eyes looked just like mine. I felt a rush of panic, my mind racing. Was this a joke? Some twisted game? My hands shook as I stuffed the photograph back into the bag and stood up, looking around the clearing. The silence felt even thicker now, pressing in on me from all sides. I turned to leave, my feet moving quickly, but then I heard it, soft footsteps behind me. Someone was following me. I didn't need to look to know. My heart pounded as I broke into a run, heading back toward the campsite as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was back at my truck, throwing my gear into the back with frantic hands. I drove away without looking back, my mind still reeling from the discovery. Whoever had been out there in the woods with me, I didn't want to meet them again. I never did figure out who had been following me or what the photograph meant. I never went back to that spot in the woods, and the memory of that night still haunts me. Sometimes, when I'm alone, I can't help but wonder, was someone watching me, or did I just imagine it all? Either way, I'm never camping alone again. I went on a solo camping trip in late September of 2017. I was 34 at the time, living in a small town called Franklin, Indiana. Things were getting hectic at work. I managed a plumbing supply warehouse, and that week had been nonstop with shipments coming late and half the staff calling off. I was tired in a way I couldn't really explain, mentally burnt out, physically sluggish, and just sick of hearing people talk. I needed to unplug, so I took a Friday off and decided to drive 3 hours south to Hooser National Forest. I'd only been there once with a friend years ago, and even then we didn't hike in far. This time I wanted to be completely alone. No nearby campers, no cell signal, no people sounds. I wanted to feel like I was in the middle of nowhere, where the world could go on without me for a few days. I packed my gear the night before. Just the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, 2 water jugs, a purifier straw, my knife, first aid kit, small hatchet, and my old green backpack. I brought a small camping stove and a steel mug for boiling water or heating soup. Kept it light. I was used to this kind of stuff. My dad used to take me hiking when I was younger, and I'd done solo hikes and camping weekends every year since my mid-20s. I left home before sunrise, made it to the forest by late morning, and parked at one of the less-used trailheads near a gravel road that most tourists avoided. The air was still warm, but I could feel fall creeping in. Leaves were starting to change, and the bugs weren't as bad. I headed down a narrow trail that curved and dipped through thick woods. I didn't see another soul. No cars at the trailhead, no voices, nothing. It was perfect. After about 2 hours of hiking, I found a spot that felt right. A little clearing set between 2 hills, far enough from the main trail that I doubted anyone would wander by. There was a small, shallow creek nearby and flat ground for my tent. I set up camp, ate a sandwich, and just sat in silence for a long time. That first day passed slow and peaceful. I wandered around a little, cut up some dead branches for firewood, and watched the light change through the trees as the sun dropped. I didn't bring a phone or a book or anything. I wanted silence. That night, I made soup on the stove, watched the fire burn down, and climbed into my sleeping bag by around 10. I woke up once in the middle of the night to pee. The air was cold, and everything was dead silent. I mean, truly silent. No bugs, no wind, no animals moving. Just complete stillness, like the whole forest was holding its breath. It made me feel a little uneasy, but I told myself it was normal for colder nights. I crawled back into my sleeping bag and drifted off again. The next morning was overcast. I made coffee, ate a granola bar, and went exploring. I followed the creek downstream for a while, crossed a patch of low ground that had turned a little marshy, and found a strange old tree with a massive hollow at its base. Something about it felt off. Couldn't say why. I didn't go near it. I just kept walking and eventually circled back toward camp. Around noon, I was sitting on a flat rock, eating jerky, when I noticed something strange. There were footprints near the edge of my camp. Not mine. They were fresher. The leaves had been disturbed in places I hadn't walked. The pattern looked like someone had come up from the direction of the creek and stopped about 10 feet from my tent, then turned back. At first, I thought maybe I had walked over there yesterday without remembering, but the ground was soft, and the footprints looked too crisp. The size looked about like mine, maybe a little bigger, and whoever it was wore boots. I stood there for a while just staring at them, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just another hiker passing by. But the direction was weird. They came from deep in the woods, not the trail, and there were no other signs of people. No trash, no broken branches, nothing. I felt a little off after that. I tried to shake it, telling myself it was just me overthinking things, but I couldn't ignore how careful the prints seemed, like the person had walked in slow, looked around, and left. Not the way someone usually moves through the woods. I didn't pack up though. I didn't want to scare myself into leaving. I'd been looking forward to this trip for weeks. That night, I didn't sleep well. I kept waking up, listening for sounds outside the tent. I heard small noises, sticks cracking, something brushing through leaves, but that's normal in the woods. Could have been raccoons, deer, anything. I kept the fire low and stayed bundled up inside the tent. Around 3 in the morning, I heard something that made my blood go cold. It was the sound of heavy breathing, just outside the tent wall. Not animal breathing, human. Slow, steady, deep. It lasted maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just lay there, heart pounding, trying to stay absolutely still. After a few minutes, I reached very slowly for my knife and just waited. Nothing happened. No more sounds. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sky finally started to lighten, I got out of the tent with the knife in hand and checked around the camp. Nothing looked disturbed. The fire pit was cold. My pack was untouched. I walked the perimeter, scanned the woods, even went down to the creek and back. I didn't see anything, but I couldn't ignore that breathing. I knew what I heard. Someone had been out there. I made a decision then. I was going to pack up and hike back to the car. I'd had enough peace and quiet. I didn't want to find out who was creeping around my tent in the middle of the night. I stuffed my gear into my pack, kicked dirt over the fire pit, and got moving. The hike back was about 6 miles, and I kept glancing over my shoulder the whole way. Every bird flutter, every squirrel bolt made me jump. About halfway to the trailhead, I noticed something else that made me stop in my tracks. Tied to a low-hanging branch beside the trail was a piece of red cloth. A strip of shirt maybe, or a bandana. It looked faded and old, but not rotten. It was tied in a simple knot like a marker. I hadn't seen it on the way in. It wasn't there before. I checked the ground around it and saw more boot prints, same size as the ones near my tent. They led off into the trees, deeper into the forest. I didn't follow them. I just kept walking. By the time I got back to the trailhead, I was soaked in sweat even though the air was cool. I threw my pack into the back of my car, locked the doors, and sat there for a while before starting the engine. Just breathing, trying to slow my heart down. I didn't see anyone on the road out, and once I got to the highway, I felt some of the tension finally start to leave my shoulders. Back home, I took the longest shower of my life and sat on the couch for hours, not doing anything, just thinking. I didn't tell anyone about what happened. I felt stupid, like maybe I'd imagined more than was really there. But I know I didn't imagine that breathing. I didn't imagine the footprints. Someone had been out there and they knew I was there too. A week later, I read something online that made me feel even worse. A local hiker had gone missing just north of where I'd camped. Guy in his 20s, experienced outdoorsman, had told friends he was going off-grid for a few days. His car was found at a different trailhead, but they never found him. No trace, just vanished. The report said he'd gone missing 2 weeks before my trip. I've thought about that a lot. I don't know if it was connected, could have been totally unrelated, but the idea stuck with me that someone might be living out there, deep in the woods, off-grid in the worst way, watching trails, watching campsites. I haven't been back to Hooser since. I still camp, but never alone, and never without a satellite phone or at least a GPS tracker. I make noise when I walk. I make sure people know where I'm going. That trip changed the way I think about being alone in the woods. It reminded me that the wildest things out there aren't wolves or bears or mountain lions. It's people, real people with quiet footsteps and no good reason to be there. I had always considered myself someone who could handle the outdoors. Growing up in a small town in northern Maine, I spent most of my childhood hiking through forests, fishing on the lakes, and camping under the stars. It felt like second nature, and I was proud of how comfortable I felt in the wild. So, when my friends suggested we take a camping trip in the summer of 2023, I was eager to get away from the city for a few days and reconnect with nature. We decided to head to a relatively remote area, a place in the woods that no one had ever been to before. It was a secluded spot near a creek, far away from the typical trails that hikers would follow. My friends, all in their mid-20s like me, were excited, though a little apprehensive about venturing into unknown territory. But I had no doubts. I assured them it would be fine. I had done it 100 times before. I knew the woods, I knew the signs of danger, and I knew what to look for when we set up camp. The drive out there took us a good few hours. The paved roads slowly faded into dirt paths as we got deeper into the forest. I could feel the tension lifting as we moved farther away from civilization. The sound of tires crunching over gravel and the occasional chirp of birds overhead was all I could hear. We didn't pass anyone else on the road, and the last sign of human life we saw was an old cabin by the side of the trail, long abandoned, with its rotting wood and overgrown weeds suggesting it hadn't been touched in years. Eventually, we parked the truck and set off on foot with our backpacks, tents, and supplies in tow. We weren't carrying too much, just the basics: sleeping bags, a few canned goods, some water, and a couple of fishing rods. The air felt clean, like nothing had touched it for years. As we trekked through the trees, the shadows of the pines grew deeper, and the sounds of the forest took over. Rustling leaves, distant bird calls, and the soft hum of insects. The creek wasn't far from the spot where we decided to set up camp. A small clearing by the water's edge made for the perfect place to pitch our tents. We worked quickly to get everything set up, a silent understanding passing between us that there was no need to rush. We were out here to relax, to let the world slow down for a few days. Once the tents were up and our campfire pit was ready, I walked down to the creek. The water was crystal clear, running fast and cold, just as I remembered the streams around my hometown. The place felt peaceful, serene even. There was something calming about hearing the water rush over rocks, the sound carrying through the air. I sat on a large stone at the edge of the creek, dipping my hand into the cool water. It was refreshing. That evening, we cooked our dinner over the fire. Simple stuff: beans, sausages, and some potatoes we had wrapped in foil. It was nothing special, but out there, everything tastes better. The night fell quickly, and the temperature dropped. We gathered around the fire, the flames dancing and crackling in the cold air. I could tell that the others were starting to relax, the stress of daily life melting away. As the fire burned low, I noticed how quiet the forest had become. The sounds of the creek and the crackling wood were all we could hear. It was a strange kind of silence, the kind that you don't often get in a city. I looked up at the sky. The stars were so bright, so clear, that it almost felt unreal. I hadn't seen a night sky like this in years. The only light pollution came from the small lantern we had hanging near the tents. I didn't think anything was out of the ordinary at first, but there was something about the stillness of the air that made my skin crawl. I could feel it, a strange tension that hung over the camp. It wasn't anything I could explain. No sounds, no movement, just an uncomfortable feeling. I glanced around at my friends, but they seemed fine, chatting and laughing like nothing was wrong. Maybe I was just imagining things. We stayed up late, talking about our lives back home, about work, and about the past. The fire eventually died down, and we decided to head to bed. I crawled into my tent, zipped it up, and settled in. The sleeping bag felt good against the cold, but my mind wouldn't stop. That weird feeling from earlier in the evening kept nagging at me. The kind of sensation you get when you're being watched. But I told myself it was just my imagination. The next morning, the sun was up early. I woke to the smell of coffee wafting through the air. I groggily climbed out of my tent and joined the others by the fire. The camp had a peaceful, lazy atmosphere. We ate breakfast and talked about what we wanted to do for the day. One of my friends, Sarah, suggested we try to fish in the creek. I thought it was a good idea, so we grabbed our rods and headed down to the water. We spent a couple of hours by the creek, casting our lines and talking. But as the day wore on, something started to feel off. There was a sense of being watched again. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing behind me, but there was never anyone there. The others didn't seem to notice, so I tried to shake it off, but it was getting harder to ignore. By the time we decided to break for lunch, I couldn't deny that I was starting to feel uneasy. My mind kept racing. It didn't make sense. I had camped in the wilderness countless times, and I had never felt like this. There was no reason to be scared. We were miles away from anyone. We were safe. But that night, as the sun set and the forest grew dark once again, the feeling returned, stronger this time. The same tension I had felt the night before was back. Only this time it was more intense. I kept my eyes fixed on the trees, listening for any sound that might break the silence. But all I could hear was the rustling of leaves in the wind. The air was thick, and it felt like it was pressing in on me from all sides. That night, I barely slept. I kept waking up, checking the time, and listening to the sounds outside my tent. At one point, I heard something, a movement in the underbrush, something large, something that wasn't an animal. It wasn't a bear or a deer, and it wasn't the wind. The sound was deliberate, like something or someone was moving carefully through the woods, just beyond the reach of the campfire's light. I lay there, frozen, trying to listen for any other sounds. But everything went quiet again. And then I heard it, footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps, just outside my tent. My heart slammed against my chest. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. I waited, hoping it was nothing, that I was just hearing things. But the footsteps didn't stop. They circled the tent, slow and steady. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs underfoot. I lay there for what felt like hours, not daring to make a sound. Then, finally, the footsteps stopped. A long, heavy silence followed. I don't know how long I waited after that, but eventually, I must have drifted off to sleep from sheer exhaustion. The next morning, the forest seemed almost too quiet. The usual sounds of the birds and insects were missing, and there was no sign of movement outside the tents. When I went to check on the others, I noticed something strange. Footprints in the mud near our camp. They weren't animal tracks. They were human tracks, fresh ones, and they were heading away from the creek, deeper into the forest. My mind raced. Who else could be out here? We hadn't seen anyone else on the drive up. There was no one else within miles of us. I felt a pit in my stomach. I wasn't sure what to do. We needed to leave, but I didn't want to panic my friends. I tried to act casual, but I could tell they were beginning to sense something wasn't right. I told them about the footprints, and we made the decision to pack up and leave. We didn't waste time. There was no arguing. We took down the tents, gathered our things, and started heading back toward the truck. But as we moved through the woods, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every rustle, every snap of a twig felt like someone was right behind us, following us. We finally reached the truck, and I started the engine. As I pulled away from the camp, I looked out the window one last time. The forest stood silent and still, as if nothing had happened. But deep down, I knew something had been wrong. Someone had been out there with us. When we finally got back to civilization, I felt a huge wave of relief. I had never been so happy to see a paved road in my life. I still don't know who or what was out there, but I know one thing for sure. Not all forests are as peaceful as they seem. We never went back, and I never will. I went camping alone in southern Idaho in the summer of 2019. I was 32 at the time and working a desk job in Salt Lake City. I'd been feeling stuck in a routine, waking up, working, eating, sleeping, and repeating. I needed to get out for a while. I'd always liked camping and I'd gone on solo trips before, but only for a night or two. This time, I planned to stay out for 4 nights. I picked a place I hadn't been to before, somewhere remote, quiet, and deep into the forest. I found it on a forum. Someone had mentioned a small, unmarked clearing not far from a hiking trail in Caribou-Targhee National Forest. I looked it up on a satellite map, marked the coordinates, and packed my gear. I brought everything I needed: my tent, sleeping bag, a camp stove, food for 5 days, a water filter, and a knife. I also brought a small axe and a bear spray canister. I wasn't too worried about wildlife. I was more concerned about getting lost or dealing with bad weather. I double-checked the forecast before I left, and it looked fine. Clear skies and mild temperatures all week. I left early on a Tuesday morning. The drive took about 4 hours. I stopped in a small town along the way to top off my gas tank and grab a sandwich. Once I reached the trailhead, I parked my car, slung my pack over my shoulders, and started hiking. The trail was marked but narrow, and I didn't see anyone else around. After about 3 miles, I left the trail and followed a game path through the trees. The forest was thick, with tall pines and patches of undergrowth that scraped against my pants. I checked my GPS now and then to make sure I was still heading toward the clearing. I reached the spot around mid-afternoon. It was exactly as described, flat, open, and ringed by trees. There was a fire ring made of stones in the middle, overgrown with grass and moss, like it hadn't been used in years. I set up my tent near the edge, where the ground was soft and shaded. After that, I made a small fire, boiled some water, and cooked a freeze-dried meal. I sat there for a while, watching the flames and listening to the sounds of the forest. Birds chirped in the distance, and now and then I'd hear branches creaking or the wind moving through the canopy. It felt good to be alone, away from phones, cars, and voices. The first night was quiet. I lay in my sleeping bag and listened for anything unusual, but all I heard were crickets and the occasional snap of a twig. In the morning, I made coffee and oatmeal, then went for a short hike around the area. I wasn't trying to get anywhere in particular. I just wanted to stretch my legs and get a feel for the terrain. I followed a dry creek bed downhill for a while, then looped back up toward camp. I found a few deer tracks and saw a rabbit dart between bushes, but nothing else. I didn't bring my phone with me since I didn't expect any signal, but I had a compass and a paper map tucked in my pack. I made sure to follow the same landmarks on the way back. That afternoon, I gathered some dry wood and sharpened sticks with my knife, not for any reason really, just something to do. I didn't hear any people, cars, or planes. It was completely still. I cooked again that night and went to sleep with no issues. It was the second night when things started to feel off. I woke up around 2 or 3 a.m., not sure why. I didn't hear anything at first, but I had that strange feeling, like something had pulled me out of sleep on purpose. I sat up in my sleeping bag and listened. The forest was silent, too silent. No insects, no wind, nothing. That was the first time I noticed how still it was. I stayed there for a few minutes, ears straining, eyes adjusting to the darkness. Then I heard something, just a soft crunch, like a footstep on dry leaves. It was faint and slow. I held my breath, It wasn't a bear. I'd heard bears in the wild before. They move heavily, crashing through brush or sniffing loudly. This was different, controlled, deliberate, like someone was trying not to be heard. I reached for my knife and waited, trying to guess the direction of the sound. It seemed to come from the trees near the fire ring. Then it stopped. I didn't hear anything for what felt like half an hour, but I couldn't go back to sleep. I just lay there, holding the knife under the blanket, staring at the nylon ceiling. Eventually, I must have dozed off, because I woke up to birdsong and sunlight coming through the tent. I got out and looked around. Nothing seemed out of place, but I felt uneasy. I walked around the clearing slowly, looking for tracks or broken branches. I found a few flattened spots in the grass near the trees, like someone had stood there, but I couldn't be sure. Could have been deer or maybe just my imagination. I didn't want to jump to conclusions. Still, I kept my knife closer that day, even when I boiled water or brushed my teeth. I thought about packing up and leaving, but I told myself I was being paranoid. I didn't want to ruin the trip over nothing. I spent most of the third day reading a paperback I'd brought and keeping the fire going, even during the day. The smoke made me feel better, like it put a barrier between me and whatever was out there. That night, I put a few big logs on the fire before going to bed and kept the axe next to me. I woke up again around 3 a.m. This time I knew what woke me. It was a sound, a metal sound, a click. I froze. I knew that sound because it was mine. My camp stove makes that exact click when you twist the fuel cap. I hadn't touched it since dinner. I stayed perfectly still and listened. There was a rustle near the fire pit, then another sound, fabric being moved, like someone unzipping a pocket or opening a bag. I didn't breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. I slowly reached for the axe and sat up without making noise. The sounds outside continued, soft but clear. Whoever it was, they weren't in a hurry. That's what scared me the most. They were confident, calm. They weren't trying to take something and leave. They were just going through my stuff like they had all night to do it. I held the axe and waited. Then I heard something closer, right outside the tent. Footsteps, slow, crunching leaves and twigs. I gripped the handle and crouched, ready to swing if the zipper started to move. But it didn't. The steps paused, then turned and walked away. I waited another 5 minutes before unzipping the tent just an inch and peeking out. I couldn't see anything. The fire was out. The clearing was dark, only moonlight through the trees. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. I sat there until dawn, waiting and listening. When the sun came up, I stepped outside. My gear was spread out near the fire ring. Someone had gone through my pack. A few food wrappers were on the ground, and one of my water bottles was missing. My stove had been opened but not broken. The scariest part was that nothing was taken except for that bottle. Whoever it was, they weren't after food or gear. They just wanted me to know they were there. I packed up immediately. It took me under 20 minutes to get everything back into my bag. I didn't eat or make coffee. I just stuffed everything in and left. I didn't even put out the ashes from the fire. I hiked fast, moving through the trees as quickly as I could. I didn't stop to rest or drink. I just kept checking over my shoulder. I didn't hear anything following me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I reached the trail and started running. My legs were burning, and I was sweating like crazy, but I didn't care. When I finally saw my car, I felt like I could breathe again. I threw my gear in the back seat, got behind the wheel, and drove. I didn't look back. I drove all the way to a gas station before I stopped. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, just sitting there, engine running, hands shaking. That was the last time I camped alone. I still go camping, but only with other people and never in unmarked spots. I reported what happened to the local Forest Service when I got home, but there wasn't much they could do. I didn't see the person. I didn't get a photo or a clear view, just the signs, the missing bottle, the scattered gear, the sound of footsteps right outside my tent. It's been years now, and I still think about it sometimes. Not every night, but often enough. The worst part isn't what happened. It's what could have happened. Whoever that was, they had every chance to do something worse. They were right there, inches from me, and they chose not to. Not that night. But maybe they've done it before. Maybe they've done worse. All I know is that I'll never put myself in that position again. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't some myth in the woods. It was just a person, and that makes it a lot scarier. It was late July of 2016, and I had just turned 30. I had taken a week off work after a long stretch of overtime at the auto parts warehouse in Peoria, Illinois. I was tired mentally and physically. My back ached constantly from lifting boxes, and my brain was fogged from fluorescent lights and loud forklifts. I needed to get away from everything. No people, no traffic, no phones buzzing in my pocket. Just trees, dirt, air, and quiet. I decided to go camping alone. I'd done it a few times before, mostly weekend trips with friends, but this time I wanted total solitude. I picked a remote spot up in northern Wisconsin near Chequamegon-Nicolet National Forest. Not one of the public campgrounds, but a hidden patch of land I'd seen on a hiking trip a couple years earlier. It was flat, surrounded by tall pines, and not far from a slow, shallow stream. I remembered thinking, back then, that it would be a perfect place to pitch a tent. That thought stuck in my mind. I packed light, just what I needed. Tent, sleeping bag, a small hatchet, a water filter, a camp stove, a few freeze-dried meals, trail mix, a couple protein bars, and some basic first aid stuff. I brought 2 bottles of water, knowing I could filter more from the stream. I also had my hunting knife and a flashlight with extra batteries. I left my phone in the glove box of my car when I parked it on the side of the narrow logging road. I didn't want it. I didn't even want the option of checking it. It was about a 4-mile hike from the car to the spot I had in mind. The trail was rough and overgrown, and I had to move slowly to avoid twisting an ankle or getting smacked in the face by low branches. There were no signs, no markers, nothing man-made except the occasional beer can or faded plastic wrapper stuck in the underbrush. It was quiet, really quiet, just the sound of birds, the soft rustle of wind, and the crunch of my boots on dried pine needles. I reached the site around 3 in the afternoon. It was just as I remembered, open enough to catch sunlight, flat enough to sleep comfortably. The stream was still there, trickling over rocks a few dozen feet away. I set up the tent, which took maybe 20 minutes, then unrolled my sleeping bag and made a quick meal of trail mix and some jerky I'd brought along. I sat on a downed log and watched the shadows stretch longer across the forest floor. That first night was uneventful. I lay in the tent listening to the breeze in the trees, the occasional call of a bird or the distant yip of a coyote. It was peaceful, exactly what I'd wanted. I fell asleep quickly and slept straight through till dawn. The second day I spent exploring the area. I didn't stray too far, just enough to stretch my legs. I followed the stream upstream for about a mile and saw deer tracks near the mud. I saw a small rabbit hop into the brush and vanish. I found some flat stones and skipped them across the water for a while. In the afternoon, I climbed a short, rocky ridge and got a better view of the surrounding woods. Just trees as far as I could see in every direction. That evening, I boiled some water for a freeze-dried meal and sat again on the log, watching the sky go from pale orange to dark blue. I thought about how this was the first time in years I hadn't spoken to another human in over 24 hours. It felt strange and good at the same time. That night, things changed. I woke up around 2 in the morning. I didn't know why. There was no loud sound, no movement, just something that pulled me out of sleep. I lay there in the dark, inside the tent, listening. Everything seemed normal at first, just the soft night noises. But then I realized something had changed. The air felt tense, like the forest was holding its breath. I sat up quietly and unzipped the sleeping bag. I could hear something, not loud, but definitely there. A soft rustling sound, like something brushing against leaves or moving slowly through the underbrush. It wasn't wind. It was low and steady, and it came from the trees behind the tent, maybe 20 or 30 feet away. I stayed perfectly still. My flashlight was next to me, but I didn't turn it on. I just listened. The sound didn't stop, and it didn't get closer. It would rustle for a few seconds, then stop. Then again, then silence. It went on like that for maybe 10 minutes. I I couldn't tell what it was. Could have been a deer, a raccoon, maybe even a bear. But something about it didn't feel right. Felt cautious, like it was trying not to be noticed. Eventually, the sound faded, and I waited another half hour before lying back down. I didn't sleep much after that. Every little noise made my heart jump. The next morning, I got up early. I walked around the site to see if I could spot any tracks or signs of what had moved around in the night. There were no prints, just some bent grass and a few broken twigs. I told myself it was probably a deer, maybe a curious one that got close. Still, the tension from the night lingered in my chest. That day, I stuck close to the camp. I didn't feel like exploring. I kept glancing around, listening hard. The woods felt different now. Not dangerous exactly, but like they were watching me. That afternoon, I heard something in the distance, far off but sharp. It sounded like metal clinking just once, a single, crisp sound that didn't belong. It was too far to investigate and didn't repeat, so I tried to ignore it. That night, I made sure everything was secured. I kept my flashlight in hand, my knife within reach. I didn't start a fire. I didn't want to draw attention. I ate cold trail mix and drank filtered water, then climbed into the tent before the sun fully set. I didn't sleep much. Around midnight, the noises came back. Same as the night before, rustling in the underbrush, slow and careful. But this time, it wasn't behind the tent. It was on the opposite side, closer to where I had left my pack by the log. I heard a soft thump, like something being dropped or tapped against wood. I held my breath. Then came a sound I'll never forget, the faint click of a zipper. I sat up straight, heart pounding, eyes wide. My pack was outside, zipped shut. There was no animal in those woods capable of unzipping a backpack. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. I just sat there in the dark, my mind racing. After a minute, everything went quiet again. Too quiet. No breeze, no insects, no distant animals. Nothing. I didn't dare leave the tent. I stayed awake the rest of the night, muscles cramped, knife gripped tight in my hand. I didn't even blink for what felt like hours. At first light, I unzipped the tent and stepped out, looking around quickly. Nothing looked disturbed at first glance. My pack was still leaning against the log, closed. But when I opened it, I saw that the top zipper had been undone, and some of my food was missing. Not all of it, just a couple bars and a pouch of freeze-dried pasta. The rest had been zipped closed again carefully. My stomach turned. I packed everything in a rush, heart still hammering. I didn't even eat breakfast. I just wanted out. I kept checking over my shoulder as I stuffed the tent and bag and strapped everything together. I started hiking back toward the car around 7. Took longer to get back. I kept stopping, listening, making sure I wasn't being followed. At one point, I saw something that made me freeze. A set of boot prints in a patch of soft dirt along the trail. Fresh. The same trail I had come in on, where I hadn't seen a single person in 2 days. These were large prints, wider than mine, deep enough to suggest a heavy person or someone carrying weight. They weren't there when I arrived. They were heading toward the direction of my camp. I didn't run. I forced myself to walk, but every step felt like it took effort. Like my legs didn't want to move. I felt exposed, like something was just behind me, watching. When I reached the car, I unlocked it fast and threw everything in the back seat. Before driving away, I stood for a moment, looking back at the tree line. There was no movement, nothing visible, but I felt it. Something had been out there, close, and it hadn't wanted to hurt me, at least not yet. It had just wanted to watch, to let me know it was there. I didn't call the police. What could I say? Some food went missing, and I heard noises in the dark. No crime, no evidence, just my word against the wind. I didn't even tell my friends or coworkers. I just told them I cut the trip short because of rain. But I haven't gone camping alone since. I still think about it sometimes. Not every day, but when I'm walking alone or hear a noise in the dark that doesn't belong. I think about those boot prints. I think about the careful zipper. I think about how whoever it was didn't hurt me, how they could have, how they chose not to. That choice is what keeps me awake at night. They were out there, and they're probably still out there, waiting, watching someone else now, maybe someone less lucky. I was 34 when I decided to take a solo camping trip into the Sierra Ancha Wilderness in Arizona. It was the fall of 2022, sometime in early November, and I'd just taken a few weeks off from work after a stressful year in Phoenix. I'd been feeling cooped up, restless, like I was wasting time sitting in an apartment staring at screens all day. So I packed my gear, drove out east past Roosevelt Lake, and parked my car off a dirt road near Parker Creek Trailhead. I chose that area because it was remote but not inaccessible, and I'd read about some old, quiet trails up in the canyons that didn't see much foot traffic after summer. I had 4 days worth of supplies, a heavy-duty backpack, a first aid kit, my phone, though I knew there wouldn't be signal, and a Garmin GPS. I also had bear spray, a knife, a flashlight, extra batteries, and all the usual basics: tent, sleeping bag, water filter. I didn't bring a gun because I wasn't planning to run into anything dangerous. That was probably a mistake, looking back. I hiked out early in the morning, following the trail for about 7 miles before veering off slightly toward a drainage that led up to an isolated saddle overlooking the next canyon. The place I found to camp wasn't exactly marked, but it was flat enough, had some tree cover, and was close to a small stream I could pull water from. I set up camp that first night without anything unusual happening. I made dinner using my camp stove, sat on a rock watching the trees swaying in the breeze, and just breathed it all in. Felt good, quiet, solitary in a way I hadn't experienced in years. The first night went fine. Cold, but I expected that. I wore thermal layers inside the bag and didn't have any trouble falling asleep. The silence in that canyon was deep. No traffic sounds, no distant voices, not even wind after midnight. Just stillness, the kind that makes your ears ring a little. The second day, I took a longer hike up the ridge behind my camp. There was a faint game trail that I followed up through some thick juniper and pine. The air was crisp, and the sun was strong enough to keep me from feeling the cold. I saw some deer tracks, some scat that looked like it came from elk, and even a few deep scratches in a tree that I figured were from a black bear. I kept my spray close but didn't feel worried. By noon, I'd made it to the top of the ridge and found a beautiful view over the other side of the canyon. I sat there for a while eating some jerky, just enjoying the emptiness around me. When I got back to camp that afternoon, something was off. My tent was still there, untouched, but one of the straps on my pack had been loosened. Not torn, just unbuckled. I assumed I had done it and forgotten, maybe when I grabbed my lunch. But then I saw that the top flap of the pack had been lifted open. Nothing was missing that I could tell, but it was strange. I always closed that thing carefully. Still, I convinced myself I must have forgotten, told myself not to get paranoid. I zipped it back up and moved on. That evening, I cooked again, ate, and listened to the creek for a while before crawling back into my tent. I remember thinking how nice it was to be out there alone, away from all the noise of normal life, but something kept me from fully relaxing. I had this slight pressure in my chest, like I was forgetting something, or like I was being watched. I kept brushing it off, telling myself it was just the isolation messing with me. That's a thing that happens when you're alone in the woods for a while. Your brain starts inventing shadows. Sometime after midnight, I woke up, not from a sound, not from cold, just awake all at once. My heart was pounding, and I didn't know why. I lay there completely still for a few minutes, listening. No wind, no animals, no sound at all. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly and sat up in the tent. My flashlight was in the side pocket, and I grabbed it and clicked it on. Nothing looked disturbed. I shined the light around the inside of the tent. Everything was where it should be. I didn't hear anything, but there was this smell, something faint, but sharp, like sweat and old metal. I can't explain it exactly, but it reminded me of when I used to work in a machine shop back in my 20s. That same oily, human, rust smell. I stayed still, listening for maybe half an hour. Eventually, I laid back down. I didn't sleep well, but nothing happened. When the sun came up, I got up fast and checked the area. No tracks, no damage. Still, I decided to shift camp slightly, maybe half a mile up the creek, just to clear my head. It wasn't logical, but I felt like I needed to move. That third day, I didn't hike much. I just spent time reorganizing my gear and moving to the new spot. This site had a better line of sight in all directions, fewer thick trees. I set up my tent closer to a boulder with some shelter from the wind. That afternoon, while collecting firewood, I found something that stopped me in my tracks. A small pile of rocks stacked in a neat column, maybe 4 feet high, with a stick poking out from the top. It didn't look natural, too balanced, too deliberate. It wasn't old either. The bark on the stick was still fresh, and the dirt around the rocks looked disturbed. I took a long step back and looked around. I didn't see anyone, but the unease that had been sitting in my gut since the night before turned into something sharper. I didn't touch the rocks. I just circled the area once more and then went back to camp with a lot more awareness of every branch snapping under my feet. That night, I didn't cook. I ate a protein bar and stayed inside my tent. I didn't use my flashlight except for a few seconds at a time, just in case there was someone nearby watching. I kept my knife close. I was planning to hike out early the next morning, even if it meant covering double the distance. Around 3 o'clock in the morning, I heard movement outside. It wasn't an animal. The steps were slow, careful. I could hear them shifting over loose rocks and leaves. I turned off my light, pulled my knife close to my chest, and didn't move. My breath was so quiet I could barely feel it. The steps circled the tent. Once, twice, then they stopped. I waited. 10 minutes passed, then 20. No sound. I couldn't see a shadow, but I could feel it. Something was just outside, standing still. When I couldn't take it anymore, I burst out of the tent with my flashlight on and my knife ready. I swept the light around the trees. Nothing, but there were footprints. Bare feet. Human. One set, no shoes, leading out toward the creek. I packed everything I could carry in less than 5 minutes. I didn't even break down the tent. I just shoved essentials into my pack, strapped it half closed, and took off with the light swinging in my hand. I didn't follow the trail. I went straight overland using my GPS and the creek as a guide. I hiked for hours without stopping, heart pounding, head on a swivel. Every branch breaking behind me made me spin. Every bird startled me. Eventually, around midday, I reached the trail again. I followed it fast, legs burning, until I reached my car. It was untouched, just as I left it. I climbed in, locked the doors, and didn't stop driving until I got to Globe, where I checked into the first motel I could find and sat in the shower for 30 minutes without moving. I never went back for the tent. I called the ranger station and gave them rough coordinates, just in case someone else stumbled onto it. I didn't explain everything. I just said I'd left in a hurry because of possible animal activity. They didn't ask many questions. I still go hiking now, but never solo, never that deep. I've told a few friends about what happened, and they always ask the same thing. What do you think it was? I don't know. It wasn't a ghost. It wasn't a monster. It was someone, person, living out there, hiding, maybe watching people like me who think the woods are empty. Whatever reason they had for sneaking around my tent in the middle of the night, I don't want to know. I'm just glad I left when I did, because I don't think they wanted to talk. And I don't think I would have walked out of that canyon if I'd waited until morning. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the woods around me seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was just me, the forest, and the deepening night. I had been hiking for a few days alone, no one for miles around. The map I had was decent enough, but the trail I'd taken didn't seem to match exactly. But that wasn't unusual. I was used to navigating the wilderness, and the feeling of isolation had always been something I enjoyed. I was 29 years old, a lover of the outdoors, and had taken many solo trips into the wilderness before. But there was something about this particular spot in the mountains of western Colorado that felt different. Not sinister, but off, something intangible. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed taller than usual, their thick trunks covered in layers of moss, casting long shadows even as daylight had faded. Or perhaps it was the way the air smelled. Crisp but oddly still, like it had been trapped in the forest for a long time. My tent was already set up near the edge of a small clearing, the entrance facing a sluggish creek that wound its way through the trees. I had hoped to make it to a designated campsite, but the dense undergrowth had made it impossible to follow the trail any longer. So here I was, alone as usual, setting up camp in a spot that seemed as good as any. The first sign that something was wrong came when I tried to start a fire. Normally, I would have had it going in minutes, but no matter how much I worked at it, the dry kindling wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but the flames only sputtered out. Finally, after 20 minutes of effort, I gave up and resorted to using my stove to heat up some dinner. I ate my meal in silence, listening to the rustle of the trees in the growing dark. Something about the night felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was a peaceful kind of silence, but an unsettling one too, like there was a secret the woods weren't sharing. As the night wore on, I settled into the cozy interior of my tent. I tried to ignore the unease that had settled into the pit of my stomach. I had been out in the wild plenty of times, but tonight felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, despite the warmth from my stove. I adjusted my sleeping bag and lay back on my pad, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The darkness outside felt vast and endless, and my mind kept returning to the quiet rustling sounds I'd heard earlier. That was when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of leaves, twigs breaking, a sound of something heavy moving through the brush. I froze. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I had no reason to believe there were any in the area. But the sound was deliberate, almost like someone walking. I held my breath, straining my ears in the pitch-black quiet. The noise continued, growing slightly louder and closer, but still in an irregular rhythm. It didn't sound like a bear or a deer. It sounded human, but no one was supposed to be out here. The trail had been deserted when I arrived. My first instinct was to call out, to let whoever it was know I was here. But something about the way the steps faltered, the sound stopping only to resume in a different direction, made me hesitate. It didn't make sense. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the forest floor. But there was nothing. No one. Still, the sound continued. Closer now. My heart thudded in my chest as the steps moved in and out of the trees, circling my camp. My breathing quickened, my mind racing. What should I do? My thoughts turned to the basic survival training I'd learned over the years, but none of it seemed to apply here. This wasn't a wild animal. This wasn't something I could scare away with noise or fire. The steps stopped, and for a long while, there was nothing but the soft murmur of the creek. I waited, tense, straining to hear something, anything. Then, just as I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, the noise started again, but this time, it was right outside my tent. A low crunch, a shuffle, a breath drawn in sharply. My blood ran cold. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my pack and reached for the tent zipper, ready to make a break for it. But the zipper caught, the fabric snagging, and for a moment, I panicked. I heard a quick scraping sound, like a hand dragging along the ground. My heart raced and the zipper finally gave way. I flung the door open and stepped out, but the night air hit me like a wall of ice. I squinted into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the trees and the underbrush, but there was no sign of anyone. No one, nothing. I was alone. I didn't know if I was relieved or more scared. I hadn't heard anything for a while now, but that didn't mean I was safe. Something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I turned back toward my tent and gathered what I could, stuffing things haphazardly into my bag. I wasn't sure where I'd go, but I had to leave. The air felt thick, and the pressure in my chest kept growing. I had no flashlight to guide me through the trees, so I fumbled with my phone, using the dim light to make my way back toward the trail. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sent me jumping, my pulse pounding in my ears. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. But I couldn't go back to the campsite. That was no longer an option. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I reached the clearing, I was breathing heavily, exhausted from the walk and the adrenaline. I had been moving quickly, but I had lost my sense of direction. The trees all looked the same, the forest stretching endlessly. My phone's light flickered, signaling that the battery was low. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out of here, to find something familiar, something that felt safe. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I heard something again. The sound of footsteps, not mine but someone else's. They were close, too close. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But there it was again. A footstep, a branch snapping. I wasn't alone. The footsteps were unmistakable now, right behind me. I could feel the presence, the weight of someone following me through the trees. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. I didn't know what I was running from. I just knew I needed to get away. But as I turned and bolted forward, I saw something in the distance, just a flicker of movement. A figure, person standing still, staring. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately, walking in the opposite direction. Away from me. I stopped, every muscle in my body frozen in place. There was something about the way they walked. They were moving as if they knew exactly where they were going, like they had been here before, like they were part of the forest itself. I watched as they disappeared into the trees, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. In the end, I didn't feel the need to chase them, to confront whatever it was. Slowly, carefully, I backed away and turned in the other direction. After a while, I found a dirt road, one that I recognized from my map. The hike back to the nearest town was long, but at least I wasn't in the woods anymore. I made it back to civilization before the sun came up. My heart still raced with the memory of those footsteps, the eerie feeling of being watched. But no one else in town seemed to know anything about strange figures in the forest. Sometimes, some questions don't have answers, and maybe that's for the best. I went on that trip to clear my head. That was the only reason. I just turned 38 and was getting tired of everything. Work, the city, the non-stop traffic, the constant background noise. I'd lived in Dayton, Ohio all my life, and I think I just reached a point where I needed something slower and quieter, even just for a few days. I'd done some camping before, nothing crazy, usually just a few friends and a fire at some state park, but I'd never really gone alone. This time, I wanted to try it solo. No texts, no coworkers, no neighbors arguing in the hallway, no cars screaming by at 2 in the morning. Just me, a tent, and the woods. That was the whole idea. I picked a place I'd never been, Wayne National Forest, down in southeastern Ohio, near the border with West Virginia. I'd heard it was peaceful, huge, and not nearly as crowded as the bigger parks. I wanted something far off, not some campground with picnic tables and neighbors 20 feet away. I found a spot on a few online hiking forums that people talked about. Somewhere remote, no marked trails, but with old logging roads you could hike along to find a good site. No official campsites, no bathrooms, just forest. It was late October, 2022. I took 4 days off work and left early on a Thursday morning. It was cold that week, but dry, mid-40s during the day, low 30s at night. I packed my car with the essentials. Tent, sleeping bag, stove, food, water, flashlight, first aid kit, fire starting gear, warm clothes, and a good knife. I even brought one of those emergency blankets just in case. I parked my car at a pull-off near a gravel road deep inside the forest, maybe 20 miles from the nearest gas station. Cell service cut out about 15 minutes before I even reached the spot. That's what I wanted. I hiked in for about 2 hours. There were no signs, no markers, just winding paths where trucks used to haul logs decades ago. Trees crowded in from all sides, mostly oaks and maples with their leaves halfway gone. The ground was soft with fallen leaves and dry underbrush. Eventually, I found a small clearing near a slope overlooking a long valley. No trash, no signs of anyone else, no footprints. It looked untouched. I pitched my tent just inside the trees and stacked some rocks for a fire ring. The sun was already low, so I gathered firewood, cooked a small meal of canned chili and crackers, and sat by the fire until dark. The first night was peaceful, cold but not unbearable. I slept in layers inside a good sleeping bag, and I woke up a few times to the sound of wind in the trees or small branches falling nearby, but nothing out of the ordinary. In the morning, I had instant coffee, oatmeal, and wandered around the area. I stayed close to camp, maybe a half-mile radius, just to get a feel for the place. Found an old tree stump torn up by raccoons, some deer tracks, a few birds, and not much else. No people, no distant engine noise, not even a plane overhead. It was quiet in a way I hadn't experienced in years. That silence didn't feel creepy. Not then. Felt like a relief. By late afternoon, I went back to camp and started another fire. I sat watching the sun set through the bare branches, shadows stretching out slowly across the woods. I cooked again, some instant rice and jerky, and added more wood to the fire. As it got dark, I remember feeling something slightly off, but I couldn't have said what it was. It was just a subtle sense, like the quiet wasn't peaceful anymore, like it was listening. I shook it off. I'd read enough camping blogs to know that your brain plays tricks on you out there, especially alone. Every squirrel sounds like a bear. Every gust of wind turns into something more in your head. I told myself that and went to sleep around 10. Sometime deep in the night, I woke up to a noise. It wasn't wind, and it wasn't branches falling. It was a clear, hard thud, like something hit the ground. A solid impact. Not big, not like a tree, but something heavier than a squirrel or raccoon. I froze in my bag, heart kicking up. I listened, holding my breath. Another sound. Movement. Something soft scraping the ground. I turned my flashlight on and unzipped the tent slowly. The fire was mostly out, just some glowing embers. I scanned the trees. Nothing. No eyes, no shapes, no sound anymore. I stayed there, crouched in the tent doorway, flashlight trembling in my hand. After 5 minutes of nothing, I convinced myself it was probably a deer. A deer stepping on something hard. Or maybe a branch fell at a weird angle. I didn't sleep well after that. I kept waking up every half hour to check around me. Nothing ever appeared. When the sun finally rose, I felt like I hadn't slept at all. I ate something small and decided to hike farther from camp, just to explore and keep my mind busy. I followed the slope down into the valley. There were no paths, just patches of flattened grass where animals had moved. I walked for a couple of hours, taking photos of trees, weird mushrooms, twisted old roots, anything that caught my eye. I turned around when I realized I didn't recognize anything anymore. I'd gone farther than I meant to. On the way back, I came across something strange. A tree large, probably 60 years old, was cleanly chopped at the base. Not rotted, not wind-snapped. It was cut. A flat, level slice about a foot off the ground, like with a chainsaw. But there were no other cut trees nearby. No signs of logging. No sawdust, no tire tracks. Nothing. Just one perfectly cut tree with no explanation. I crouched to look closer. The cut looked old, weathered at the edge, but the inside wood was still pale. I walked a slow circle around it. Still nothing to see. It was just out there, in the middle of nowhere. I got a bad feeling standing there, like someone had done it recently, and maybe they were still around. I hurried back to camp, checking over my shoulder every few minutes. The woods suddenly felt tighter, the trees closer. When I finally saw the corner of my tarp through the brush, I felt some relief, until I got closer and realized something had moved. The rocks around my fire pit had been kicked out of place. Not rolled, not collapsed. Kicked. One was a good 10 feet from where it had been the night before. I stared at it for a long time. Maybe an animal? Maybe something big trying to dig for food? But nothing was missing. My gear was untouched. Food bags still hanging from the tree. I walked slow circles around camp for almost an hour, checking for prints, claw marks, anything. But the ground was covered in leaves. Nothing clear. That evening, I made my fire bigger. I kept it roaring until well past midnight. I didn't want to sleep. I kept my knife on me. I kept my boots on. I just sat in my chair, flashlight in one hand, staring into the trees. I didn't see anything. I didn't hear anything either. but the entire forest felt wrong. Not loud, not active, just off. That's the only way I can put it. Like the trees were holding their breath. I finally got into my tent but didn't sleep. Not really. I kept the light on. Every sound outside made me jolt. At dawn, I packed everything. Fast. I didn't cook breakfast. I just rolled up my gear and threw it into my pack. I hiked out the way I came, retracing my steps, watching every shadow. I must have jumped at 10 different rustling bushes, and my heart didn't slow down until I saw my car again. I didn't even take my boots off. I just got in and drove. When I finally got to a gas station with signal, I checked the time. I'd only been out there 2 nights. Felt like a week. I never figured out what happened. Maybe it was someone else out there, someone avoiding people. Maybe it was nothing. But I've been camping since then, plenty of times, and I've never felt that again. That thick, crawling sense that I was being watched. That something was just out of sight. And that tree I found, the one perfectly cut in the middle of nowhere. I don't know why it stays in my head, but it does. Someone was there. Someone had been close, maybe watching, maybe just passing through. And I think they knew I was there too. I haven't gone back to Wayne National Forest. I still camp, but I pick different places now. Places with signs. Places with other people nearby. Not because I'm afraid of the woods. I'm afraid of who else might be in them. The sun had already dipped below the horizon, and the woods around me seemed to stretch endlessly in every direction. It was just me, the forest, and the deepening night. I had been hiking for a few days alone, no one for miles around. The map I had was decent enough, but the trail I'd taken didn't seem to match exactly. But that wasn't unusual. I was used to navigating the wilderness, and the feeling of isolation had always been something I enjoyed. I was 29 years old, a lover of the outdoors, and had taken many solo trips into the wilderness before. But there was something about this particular spot in the mountains of western Colorado that felt different. Not sinister, but off, something intangible. Maybe it was the way the trees loomed taller than usual, their thick trunks covered in layers of moss, casting long shadows even as daylight had faded. Or perhaps it was the way the air smelled. Crisp but oddly still, like it had been trapped in the forest for a long time. My tent was already set up near the edge of a small clearing, the entrance facing a sluggish creek that wound its way through the trees. I had hoped to make it to a designated campsite, but the dense undergrowth had made it impossible to follow the trail any longer. So here I was, alone as usual, setting up camp in a spot that seemed as good as any. The first sign that something was wrong came when I tried to start a fire. Normally, I would have had it going in minutes, but no matter how much I worked at it, the dry kindling wouldn't catch. I tried again and again, but the flames only sputtered out. Finally, after 20 minutes of effort, I gave up and resorted to using my stove to heat up some dinner. I ate my meal in silence, listening to the rustle of the trees in the growing dark. Something about the night felt heavy, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. It was a peaceful kind of silence, but an unsettling one too, like there was a secret the woods weren't sharing. As the night wore on, I settled into the cozy interior of my tent. I tried to ignore the unease that had settled into the pit of my stomach. I had been out in the wild plenty of times, but tonight felt different. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, despite the warmth from my stove. I adjusted my sleeping bag and lay back on my pad, staring at the ceiling of my tent. The darkness outside felt vast and endless, and my mind kept returning to the quiet rustling sounds I'd heard earlier. That was when I heard it. The unmistakable crunch of leaves, twigs breaking, a sound of something heavy moving through the brush. I froze. My first thought was that it might be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I had no reason to believe there were any in the area. But the sound was deliberate, almost like someone walking. I held my breath, straining my ears in the pitch-black quiet. The noise continued, growing slightly louder and closer, but still in an irregular rhythm. It didn't sound like a bear or a deer. It sounded human, but no one was supposed to be out here. The trail had been deserted when I arrived. My first instinct was to call out, to let whoever it was know I was here. But something about the way the steps faltered, the sound stopping only to resume in a different direction, made me hesitate. It didn't make sense. I grabbed my flashlight, turned it on, and shone it toward the noise. The beam cut through the darkness, scanning the forest floor. But there was nothing. No one. Still, the sound continued. Closer now. My heart thudded in my chest as the steps moved in and out of the trees, circling my camp. My breathing quickened, my mind racing. What should I do? My thoughts turned to the basic survival training I'd learned over the years, but none of it seemed to apply here. This wasn't a wild animal. This wasn't something I could scare away with noise or fire. The steps stopped, and for a long while, there was nothing but the soft murmur of the creek. I waited, tense, straining to hear something, anything. Then, just as I began to think I had imagined the whole thing, the noise started again, but this time, it was right outside my tent. A low crunch, a shuffle, a breath drawn in sharply. My blood ran cold. I had to get out of here. I grabbed my pack and reached for the tent zipper, ready to make a break for it. But the zipper caught, the fabric snagging, and for a moment, I panicked. I heard a quick scraping sound, like a hand dragging along the ground. My heart raced and the zipper finally gave way. I flung the door open and stepped out, but the night air hit me like a wall of ice. I squinted into the darkness, the beam of my flashlight dancing over the trees and the underbrush, but there was no sign of anyone. No one, nothing. I was alone. I didn't know if I was relieved or more scared. I hadn't heard anything for a while now, but that didn't mean I was safe. Something was wrong. The feeling of being watched was overwhelming, and I couldn't shake the sense that someone was just out of sight, waiting for the right moment. I turned back toward my tent and gathered what I could, stuffing things haphazardly into my bag. I wasn't sure where I'd go, but I had to leave. The air felt thick, and the pressure in my chest kept growing. I had no flashlight to guide me through the trees, so I fumbled with my phone, using the dim light to make my way back toward the trail. Every snap of a twig or rustle in the bushes sent me jumping, my pulse pounding in my ears. The further I went, the more the woods seemed to close in around me. But I couldn't go back to the campsite. That was no longer an option. The trail seemed to stretch on forever. By the time I reached the clearing, I was breathing heavily, exhausted from the walk and the adrenaline. I had been moving quickly, but I had lost my sense of direction. The trees all looked the same, the forest stretching endlessly. My phone's light flickered, signaling that the battery was low. I didn't care anymore. I just wanted to get out of here, to find something familiar, something that felt safe. As I stumbled through the underbrush, I heard something again. The sound of footsteps, not mine, but someone else's. They were close, too close. I froze. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear anything else. But there it was again. A footstep, a branch snapping. I wasn't alone. The footsteps were unmistakable now, right behind me. I could feel the presence, the weight of someone following me through the trees. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I was paralyzed. I didn't know what I was running from. I just knew I needed to get away. But as I turned and bolted forward, I saw something in the distance, just a flicker of movement. A figure, person standing still, staring. And then it moved, slowly, deliberately, walking in the opposite direction. Away from me. I stopped, every muscle in my body frozen in place. There was something about the way they walked. They were moving as if they knew exactly where they were going, like they had been here before, like they were part of the forest itself. I watched as they disappeared into the trees, my mind struggling to make sense of what had just happened. In the end, I didn't feel the need to chase them, to confront whatever it was. Slowly, carefully, I backed away and turned in the other direction. After a while, I found a dirt road, one that I recognized from my map. The hike back to the nearest town was long, but at least I wasn't in the woods anymore. I made it back to civilization before the sun came up. My heart still raced with the memory of those footsteps, the eerie feeling of being watched. But no one else in town seemed to know anything about strange figures in the forest. Sometimes, Some questions don't have answers, and maybe that's for the best. It was late September 2018 when I decided to take a short solo camping trip before the weather got too cold. I had just turned 32 a few weeks earlier, and work had been draining lately. I was living in Laramie, Wyoming, working as a mechanic at a small shop off the highway, and I just needed to step away from everything for a while. I'd always loved getting out into the mountains. I wasn't really into the crowded campgrounds or places with amenities, so I usually found myself a more remote place to pitch a tent. Somewhere quiet where I could fish, hike, and not see another person for a couple days. That time I chose a spot in Medicine-bound National Forest, about an hour and a half west of town, near the southern edge. I'd been there before a couple years back with an old friend and remembered it being a great place to fish and hike. The trail we'd followed then was pretty overgrown and didn't get much foot traffic, which made it perfect for what I wanted. I spent the whole week leading up to the trip prepping gear. I packed my old army rucksack with the basics: tent, sleeping bag, food for 3 days, water, a filter pump, some fishing line and hooks, a hatchet, knife, flashlight, and my little camp stove. I also packed my .357 revolver. I usually didn't carry when camping, but I'd seen a few mountain lions in that area years before, and I figured it was better to be safe than sorry. I left early on a Friday morning around 5 a.m. I wanted to get to the trailhead while it was still cool out and make camp before nightfall. The drive was smooth, just me, a thermos of strong coffee, and the rising sun. I turned off the paved road onto a long, bumpy Forest Service road and drove it for a good 45 minutes. The forest around me was thick, pines, spruce, and the occasional aspen tree already shedding yellow leaves. At one point, I had to stop and move a fallen branch just to keep going. I didn't see a single car the entire way. When I finally reached the clearing near the old trailhead, I parked my truck behind a stand of trees, shouldered my pack, and headed off on foot. The trail wasn't well marked anymore, and about half a mile in, it started fading into the brush. I kept a steady pace, though, checking my compass occasionally and using landmarks I remembered. An old stump that looked like a chair, a fallen log bridge over a narrow creek, a boulder with a strange red streak down the middle. After about 2 hours of hiking, I came to a small flat area next to a stream that cut through a narrow valley. The stream was shallow, clear, and filled with little brook trout darting through the stones. I set up my tent near the stream, just far enough to avoid any flooding if it rained, and cleared a spot for a fire pit. I was sweating by the time I got everything set up, so I took off my boots and waded into the stream for a while. The water was freezing but felt good on my legs. The place was perfect, silent except for the breeze through the trees and the rush of the water. I didn't see or hear any other people all day. That night, I made a small fire and heated up a can of chili, then sat with my back against a tree, watching the stars come out. I slept hard that night. Nothing disturbed me. The next day, I spent the morning fishing. I used my little travel rod and caught 4 small trout, which I cooked over the fire. In the afternoon, I went exploring farther up the stream. The terrain started climbing, and I found a little ravine that looked like it might have once been a game trail. There were old prints in the mud, deer or elk, maybe a week old. I followed the path up for a while, just soaking in the quiet. No phone, no people, no noise. Around late afternoon, I headed back to camp. It was on the way back that I noticed something that didn't sit right. A snapped branch, fresh, still green at the break. I hadn't noticed it on the way up. I stopped and looked around but didn't see anything out of place. Could have been wind or an animal, I figured. Still, I kept my hand on the grip of my revolver the rest of the way back. That night, as I lay in my tent, I heard something. It was faint, just outside the range where you can tell exactly what it is. It wasn't the usual sounds: wind, water, animals. It was steady and soft, like something being dragged. I sat up, listening. It went on for maybe 10 seconds, then stopped. Silence again. I unzipped my sleeping bag slowly and grabbed the revolver, holding it close, but I didn't go outside. Eventually, I must have fallen asleep. The next morning, I stepped out of the tent and looked around. Everything looked fine, but I noticed a rock about the size of a football sitting near the fire pit. I hadn't put it there. I was sure of it. It was too big and out of place. I walked a few circles around the camp, checked the tree line, but saw nothing. No tracks, no damage, nothing moved. I tried to brush it off. Maybe I missed it when I set up, though that didn't feel right. I hiked a shorter route that day, staying closer to camp. I tried not to think about the rock or the dragging noise. By midday, clouds were building fast, and I could hear distant thunder. I decided to gather wood and prepare for a storm. I found a bunch of dead branches and built a dry stack under a pine tree. I reinforced the tent with extra stakes and made sure everything was waterproofed. The storm rolled in hard around dusk. Sharp wind, heavy rain, and lightning that lit up the valley in white flashes. I stayed in the tent, dry and warm, listening to it rage around me. Then, in the middle of the storm, I heard it again, that dragging sound, but closer this time. Then a thud, like something dropped. I held the revolver and stayed still. There was no way an animal would be out in that mess. The dragging lasted only a few seconds. Then nothing. In the morning, the rain had stopped, and everything was soaked. I stepped out and looked around. Another rock, this one flatter and darker, was sitting right in front of my tent flap. My stomach turned. It wasn't there before. I walked a big loop around the camp, this time going farther out. Still no footprints. No signs of anything or anyone. But now I was sure. Someone was messing with me. I debated packing up and heading back right away. But I didn't want to panic. Maybe it was just coincidence, some freak weather thing, falling rocks, though that didn't explain the dragging sounds. I decided I'd leave the next morning, just to be safe. That whole day I stayed alert, barely leaving camp, and kept the fire going nonstop. When night fell, I didn't sleep. I sat outside the tent, back to the tree, flashlight and gun in my lap. The sky was clear again, stars bright, and the wind was calm. Around 2 a.m., I heard the dragging again. This time it was louder. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, but it was coming from the opposite direction. I whipped around, shining the beam through the trees, and caught a glimpse of something dark, just at the edge. Too big to be an animal, too low to be a person standing. I yelled, not words, just a sound, then fired a shot into the dirt. The flash lit up the trees, but there was nothing there now. Silence again. I stayed up the rest of the night. The first light, I packed up everything as fast as I could. My hands were shaking as I rolled the tent. I didn't even cook breakfast. I just threw everything into my pack and started hiking. The forest felt different. I kept glancing behind me, sure something was going to come out of the trees. The hike back took longer than it should have. I was moving quick, trying to stay quiet. About halfway back, I noticed more branches broken. 2, maybe 3 fresh. Then I saw another rock, perfectly round, placed right in the middle of the trail. I stepped around it, gun in hand the rest of the way. When I reached my truck, it was untouched, but the passenger door was wide open. I know I didn't leave it that way. I checked the cab, nothing stolen, nothing moved, just open. That was it for me. I threw the pack in, slammed the door, and drove until I hit pavement again. I didn't stop until I got home. I didn't tell anyone the full story. I said the weather got rough and I cut it short. But I knew someone had been out there, watching, maybe following me, leaving things just close enough for me to notice. Not trying to hurt me, not yet, just pushing, seeing how far I'd go. Maybe they lived out there. Maybe they didn't like people on their land. Or maybe it was just a sick game. I never went back to that area again. I still camp, but I stick to more public places now, where there's noise, other people, maybe even a ranger station nearby. I keep my gear lighter. I still carry the revolver, but now it's always within arm's reach, even while I sleep. And I never, ever ignore a broken branch again. I decided to get away from the busy life in the city, seeking peace and quiet in the woods. The summer was dragging on, and I was starting to feel overwhelmed by the never-ending responsibilities and noise around me. After some searching, I found a small cabin for rent, deep in the forest. It was isolated just how I wanted it. There was no cell service, no internet, and only a dirt road leading to it. The idea of being alone, in a place where I could truly disconnect, seemed like a dream. The cabin was in the northern part of Maine, not far from the Canadian border. It was a rustic wooden structure, built in the 1970s, and looked like it hadn't been updated much since then. The outside was weathered, with peeling paint and a porch covered in moss. Still, there was something charming about it. I figured that it would be a great escape. I was 32 years old, and though I wasn't afraid of being alone in nature, there was a part of me that wondered what kind of things might happen out there. The locals at the small town I passed through on my way seemed nice enough, but there was a quietness to them, an air of unease that I couldn't quite shake off. They didn't ask why I was there, but there was a hesitation when I mentioned the cabin. It was a Friday afternoon when I arrived. The sun was starting to dip low in the sky, casting a golden hue over the trees as I made my way up the narrow, gravel driveway. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods on all sides. The only sounds were the wind rustling the leaves and the distant calls of birds. It was serene but almost too quiet. I unloaded my car and set up my things inside. The cabin had a simple layout: one bedroom, a small kitchen, a bathroom, and a living room. There was a stone fireplace in the living room with a few chairs around it. The furniture was old but sturdy, and the floors creaked beneath my feet. The windows were large, offering a view of the forest, and there was a thick blanket of trees just beyond the cabin. As I settled in, I couldn't help but feel the weight of isolation pressing down on me. It wasn't that I was afraid of being alone, but there was something unnerving about the silence. There were no street sounds, no hum of traffic, nothing. Just the occasional crack of a branch or the rustle of leaves. It made me feel small and insignificant. I tried to shake off the feeling, telling myself that it was just the unfamiliarity of being in a new place. I made a simple dinner, something quick, and then lit a fire in the hearth. The warmth from the flames was comforting, and the crackling sounds soothed me. I spent the evening reading a book, but it wasn't long before I started hearing things. At first, it was faint, almost imperceptible. I thought I heard footsteps outside, but when I looked through the window, there was nothing. No movement, no sign of life. I dismissed it as my imagination. After all, it's easy to think you hear things when you're in a quiet, unfamiliar place. But the noises continued. It was around 11 p.m. when I heard a thud outside, followed by a rustling sound. I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. My heart raced, and I found myself holding my breath, listening. The sound of footsteps returned, but this time they were clearer, closer. My mind immediately went to all the possibilities. Was it an animal? Person? Maybe some hikers who had wandered off the trail? I grabbed a flashlight and stepped outside onto the porch, scanning the trees for any movement. The light barely cut through the darkness, but I saw nothing. The woods were still, except for the occasional creak of branches swaying in the wind. My breath hung in the air, and I could feel the chill of the night setting in. I stood there for a while, just listening. The rustling had stopped. I shook my head and laughed nervously to myself. I was being paranoid. After all, I was in the middle of nowhere, and there was nothing out here. Just me, the cabin, and the trees. I decided to head back inside, but just before I closed the door, I saw something out of the corner of my eye. A shadow darted across the clearing, just beyond the edge of the porch. It was quick, almost too quick for me to fully register what I'd seen. I blinked, but when I looked again, there was nothing. I felt my stomach tighten. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The cabin seemed colder now, the silence heavier. I locked the door behind me and double-checked the windows. Everything seemed fine, but that nagging feeling wouldn't go away. I went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of the wind outside, made me jump. Felt like I was being watched. The night dragged on, and the darkness outside seemed to press in on the cabin. The next morning, I tried to brush off the strange occurrences of the night before. I made coffee, took a long shower, and spent the day hiking around the area, trying to shake the unsettling feeling. The forest was beautiful, but it was also vast and isolating. There were no trails, no signs of other people. It was just miles and miles of trees and underbrush. As the days passed, the weirdness continued. I started hearing the sounds more frequently. Footsteps, rustling, things moving in the woods. Sometimes, I'd step outside and find small twigs and branches broken on the ground, as if something had walked through the clearing. I tried to convince myself it was just animals, but the way the sounds came and went felt deliberate, like something was watching me. One evening, as I sat by the fire, I noticed something else. There were no insects around, no mosquitoes, no moths drawn to the light. It was as if the whole area had been drained of life. The woods felt too still, too quiet. It was like nature itself was holding its breath. The next night, I heard a knock on the door. It was soft, almost imperceptible at first, but it was definitely there. Knock, knock, knock. 3 quick raps. I froze, my pulse racing. I wasn't expecting anyone. There was no one for miles. I grabbed the flashlight again and cautiously opened the door, but there was no one there, just the cold night air and the dark woods. I stepped outside, my heart thumping in my chest. The silence was oppressive, and I scanned the area, looking for any sign of movement. I found nothing. It was like whatever had knocked was gone. I felt ridiculous for being so scared, but at the same time, there was a part of me that knew something was off. The next morning, I decided to leave. I packed my things, loaded up the car, and prepared to head back to town. As I was walking to the car, I noticed something strange by the cabin's front porch. Marks in the dirt, deep gouges as if something heavy had been dragged across the ground. I followed the marks with my eyes, and they led into the woods, disappearing into the trees. It was then that I realized someone or something had been near the cabin, maybe for days. I didn't stick around to investigate further. I got into my car and drove off, my eyes constantly scanning the woods in the rearview mirror. The drive back to town was a blur. I was shaken, but I didn't feel like I had been in any danger. Whatever had been happening, whatever I had been hearing, hadn't done me any harm. It was just a strange, unsettling experience, but I couldn't deny that the woods had a presence. Something had been watching me, maybe even waiting for me to leave. I never went back to that cabin. I returned the keys, never spoke about the experience, and avoided the area entirely. But as the years went on, I would occasionally think back to that place, the silence, the shadows in the trees, and wonder if I had been imagining things, or if there really was something out there, just beyond the edge of the woods, watching. I had never really thought of myself as the type to go into the woods. Not in the middle of nowhere, anyway. But when my friend Rachel invited me to her family's cabin in the backwoods of Oregon, I thought it might be nice to get away from the noise, the rush of city life, and have a peaceful weekend. A place to clear my head. I didn't expect much. Just some quiet time, maybe a good book, and a few days to catch up with Rachel, who had been living in Portland for the last few years. The cabin was tucked deep into the woods. Rachel's family had owned it for decades, though they rarely visited anymore. The year was 2023, and I was 27 years old. Rachel was a year younger, but we had known each other since college. She had always been a bit of a recluse, and the cabin seemed to fit that. Surrounded by towering trees and thick forest, it was the kind of place where you couldn't help but feel small, like nature was taking up all the space. The only sounds were the wind in the trees, the chirping of birds, and the occasional distant howl of an animal. When I arrived at the cabin, Rachel was already there, unloading the car. She greeted me with a big hug, and I could tell right away that she was excited about the weekend. The air was cold, with a crispness that only seemed to grow as the sun began to dip lower in the sky. I noticed that the cabin itself had an old, worn feel. The wood had weathered over time, with some parts of the porch creaking underfoot. There was a slight mustiness to the air inside, and the smell of aged wood filled the rooms. Rachel led me through the cabin, pointing out where everything was. The main room was cozy, with a stone fireplace on one wall and a few mismatched pieces of furniture scattered around. There was an old record player, and Rachel mentioned that her family used to play music on it when they came up here. A small kitchen sat off to the side, equipped with the basics, and a spiral staircase led up to the loft, which held the bedrooms. Rachel showed me to a small room on the ground floor that I'd be staying in. It wasn't much, but it was enough. A bed, a couple of chairs, and a dresser. There was an old, stained rug on the floor, and the window looked out into the thick woods that stretched for miles. The first night was calm. We had a fire in the fireplace and drank wine, talking about the years that had passed. Rachel told me how much she loved the cabin, but that she hadn't been there in months. Her parents had stopped coming up after they got older, and it had become more of a place for family gatherings than a permanent home. I couldn't help but notice how she seemed a little off. There was a quiet tension in the way she spoke, something unspoken lingering in the air. Still, it wasn't anything I thought too much about. We were just two old friends catching up. The next day, we decided to take a walk through the woods. Rachel knew the trails, and she seemed eager to show me around. We walked for a few hours, breathing in the fresh air, the scent of pine needles, and the sound of leaves crunching beneath our feet. The forest was dense, but the trails were clear, and the further we walked, the more isolated we felt. There was something peaceful about it, but also slightly unsettling. The deeper we got into the woods, the quieter it seemed. The birds, which had been so loud earlier, seemed to have disappeared. As we wandered off the trail, Rachel seemed to get more and more agitated. I noticed her looking around, her steps quickening. "We should probably head back," she said, her voice a little too sharp. I didn't think much of it at the time. Maybe she was just tired or anxious, though I couldn't place exactly why. When we finally made it back to the cabin, the sun had started to set. The air had grown colder, and there was a heavy silence that hung between us. We made dinner, but the usual chatter wasn't there. Rachel had become distant, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I didn't want to pry, so I kept to myself, finishing my meal and retreating to my room for the night. The night passed slowly. The wind outside picked up, causing the trees to sway violently. I could hear the occasional creak of the house settling, the fire crackling in the hearth, and the strange noises from the woods. Every so often, I'd hear a distant rustle, like something or someone was moving outside. But when I went to the window and looked out into the pitch-black forest, there was nothing there. It wasn't until the third night that things really started to get unsettling. We had gone to bed early after another quiet dinner. I was half asleep when I heard a thudding noise from somewhere in the house. My eyes shot open, and I lay perfectly still, trying to make sense of the sound. It wasn't loud, but it was persistent, like something heavy being dragged across the floor. I listened intently, trying to tell where it was coming from. The sound was faint but distinct, coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. My mind raced with all the possibilities. Wind, the house settling, maybe an animal? But as the noise continued, it became harder to ignore. My heart started to pound in my chest. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I got out of bed quietly, moving toward the door, careful not to wake Rachel. The house was dark and cold, the only light coming from the faint glow of the dying embers in the fireplace. The thudding sound stopped as soon as I stepped into the hallway. A shiver ran down my spine as I stood frozen in place. My ears rang with the silence that followed. I waited, straining to hear anything, but nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn back to my room, I heard something else. A soft, scraping sound, like nails on wood, coming from the very back of the house. I didn't move at first. My feet felt glued to the floor, and my breath caught in my throat. Every instinct in me told me to turn around, to go back to the safety of my room, but I couldn't. Something deep in my gut told me to go check it out. Slowly, I made my way toward the back of the house, my heart hammering in my chest with every step. I reached the doorway leading to the back room. The door was slightly ajar, and as I pushed it open, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The room was empty, but as I looked closer, I noticed that the floorboards in the far corner were disturbed. There was dirt, freshly scattered across the wood, as if someone had been digging there recently. My mind raced, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I couldn't explain it, but I felt like I was being watched. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, unable to move or speak. The silence of the room was oppressive, and I felt the overwhelming need to leave, to get away from whatever it was that had been there. I didn't wait for anything else. I turned and ran back to my room, locking the door behind me. I tried to calm my breath, to convince myself that it was just my imagination running wild, but I couldn't. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something had been here. The next morning, Rachel was already up, packing up her things. She looked pale, her eyes wide and distant, like she hadn't slept at all. When I asked her if everything was okay, she just nodded, her lips tight. There was no hint of the friendly, easygoing Rachel I knew. She was distant, almost as if she were avoiding me. We packed up and left early, and as we drove away from the cabin, I could see her glance in the rearview mirror, her eyes fixed on the woods behind us. I asked her if she was okay, but she didn't answer. She just kept driving. I'll never know what exactly happened in that cabin, or what we heard during those nights, but the feeling that something had been watching us, waiting for us, stayed with me long after I left. I never went back to that cabin, and Rachel, well, I never heard from her again. As I sit here now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that I'm still being watched. The cabin was supposed to be the perfect escape. I had needed time away from everything: work, people, the endless noise of city life. A few days in the mountains, surrounded by nothing but trees, animals, and the quiet hum of nature. I had rented the place through a website, a cozy little spot in the Adirondacks, in New York. The owner seemed nice enough and everything was laid back. I didn't expect it to be anything extraordinary, just a simple, quiet retreat. I arrived late on a Friday afternoon, the sun already dipping behind the tall pines that surrounded the property. The road to the cabin was long and winding, with only the occasional passing car. The last few miles were gravel, the kind that made your tires bump against the earth as the trees closed in tighter, cutting off the distant view of civilization. I didn't mind. If anything, it added to the sense of isolation I was craving. The cabin was small but charming. Its wood was weathered and aged, the kind that spoke of years and years of standing in the elements. The porch had a couple of rocking chairs, and there was a small wooden sign hanging above the door with the name of the place, Maple Ridge. I unloaded my bags into the cabin and started setting up. The interior was exactly as described. A simple living room with a stone fireplace, a tiny kitchen, and a small bathroom tucked in the back. The bedroom had a queen-sized bed with a quilted cover, and a window that looked out onto the forest. It was all so peaceful, so calm, exactly what I needed. The first night was quiet. I made dinner, a simple pasta, and spent the evening reading by the fire. I turned in early, the quiet of the cabin lulling me to sleep. The wind whispered through the trees, the occasional creak of the wooden structure only adding to the ambience of seclusion. It wasn't until the second night that things started to feel off. I had gone for a hike that day, deep into the woods. The path was narrow, overgrown in parts, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became. It felt like the trees were closing in, blocking out the sky above. I didn't see a single soul on the trail, not even a hiker, which was strange given that this area was known for its trails. I had the whole place to myself. I came back to the cabin just as the sun set, feeling tired but good. The hike had been long, and the weather had turned chilly. I started a fire, cooked another simple dinner, and then settled in for the evening. That's when I first noticed something strange. It wasn't the wind or the sounds of animals. It was a tapping, soft at first, like someone was tapping lightly against the cabin's walls. I told myself it was just the trees, their branches brushing against the wood. But the tapping came again, louder this time. I felt a cold shiver crawl down my spine. I tried to ignore it, but as the night wore on, the tapping became more persistent. It was coming from somewhere near the back of the cabin. I glanced around, but I couldn't see anything out of place. The porch was empty, and the lights were off in the other rooms. Maybe it was just the house settling, I thought. Old cabins could do that, right? I tried to shake off the feeling of unease, but it wasn't working. Every time the tapping came, I couldn't help but feel like I wasn't alone. I checked the windows, nothing. The door was locked, and I made sure to double-check it before heading to bed. That night, the tapping didn't stop. I tried to fall asleep, but the sound kept me up. I lay there in the dark, listening to it, wondering if I was just being paranoid. But it wasn't just the tapping that bothered me. It was the silence that followed it. After every tap, the night would fall dead still, like whatever was making the noise was listening too. I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy feeling in my chest, like something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I told myself to stay calm. It was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of the place. I decided to go for a morning walk, hoping to clear my mind. The air was crisp and fresh, the trees tall and imposing. I walked down the gravel path that led to a small stream a few hundred yards away, trying to distract myself. As I approached the stream, something caught my eye. There was a patch of disturbed earth, a small hole in the ground, as though something had been dug up recently. It was strange. It didn't look like an animal's work. The hole was too clean, the edges too neat. I knelt down to take a closer look. There was nothing inside the hole now, just loose dirt. But something about it felt wrong. I stood up and quickly backed away, not wanting to linger any longer. The feeling in the pit of my stomach was growing, and I couldn't shake the sense that I was being watched. When I returned to the cabin, I decided to leave the window open a crack, hoping the fresh air would help. But that night, the tapping came again, louder than ever. Now it wasn't just at the back of the cabin, it was coming from all sides. First the back, then the front, then the side. It was like something or someone was moving around the cabin, tapping on the walls. I bolted out of bed, my heart racing. The tapping was followed by something else now, a dragging noise. It was soft but unmistakable. It was as if something was being scraped across the floor. I grabbed a flashlight and crept out of the bedroom, holding my breath. I walked slowly, carefully, toward the source of the sound. The living room was dark, except for the faint glow of the fire in the fireplace. The air was thick with the scent of burning wood. That's when I saw it. A figure was standing by the window, just barely visible, but it was there, motionless. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, to move, to run, but I couldn't. The figure didn't seem to notice me. It just stood there, staring into the forest, as if waiting for something. I don't know how long I stood there, just watching, but eventually, the figure turned and disappeared into the woods. The dragging noise stopped. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. The next morning, I packed up and left. I didn't care if the cabin was paid for. I wasn't staying another minute. I grabbed my stuff and rushed out the door, not even bothering to check for my car keys. I just needed to get out. As I drove away, I looked in the rearview mirror one last time. The cabin was small, barely visible through the trees. And then, just for a moment, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing on the porch watching me leave. I never went back to that cabin. Something about it stayed with me. An unease, a feeling I couldn't shake. To this day, I don't know who or what was tapping on the walls or what I saw that night by the window. But I learned one thing for sure. Sometimes, the quietest places hide the darkest secrets. I'd never expected to find myself in this situation, alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere. My name is Mark, and I'm 34 years old. I had always loved the idea of escaping from the world for a while, just getting away from the daily grind of city life. So when I found this remote cabin up in the North Carolina mountains, I thought it would be the perfect weekend retreat. I'd rented the place for 3 days. It was supposed to be peaceful, a time for me to relax, read, and recharge. I arrived on a Friday afternoon, greeted only by the sounds of birds and the rustling of the wind through the trees. The cabin was small but charming, tucked away on a small hillside with a view of the surrounding forest. It had no neighbors for miles, which was exactly what I was looking for. The cabin itself was made of rough-hewn wood, the kind that gave it an old, rustic feel. There was a small porch out front with a couple of rocking chairs, and inside, a stone fireplace that seemed to be begging for a fire. I couldn't wait to light it later that evening, maybe with a book in hand and a glass of wine at my side. Everything about the place was quiet, the kind of quiet that I wasn't used to, but it was exactly what I had come for. I unpacked my things, settled into the cabin, and spent the rest of the afternoon walking around the surrounding forest. The trees were thick, their branches swaying in the wind. It felt peaceful, almost surreal, as if I had stepped into a different world entirely. That night, as the sun sank behind the mountains, I built a fire in the stone fireplace and sat in the rocking chair, sipping on some wine. The flames crackled and popped, casting flickering shadows around the room. The only other sounds were the occasional rustle of the wind and the distant calls of owls. It was around midnight when I heard the first noise. At first, I thought it was just the house settling, or maybe an animal outside. But then it came again. This faint scratching sound, like something dragging along the wooden walls of the cabin. I froze, my glass of wine held halfway to my mouth. My mind raced, trying to figure out what it could be. The cabin was old, but it didn't feel like the type of place that would creak and groan just from the wind. I stood up and walked to the window, peering out into the darkness. The wind had picked up, the trees swaying wildly, but there was no sign of anything moving close to the cabin. I shook it off. Maybe it was just an animal, a raccoon or a squirrel, getting too close to the building. The noise didn't come again that night, and I tried to convince myself it was just the wind or the house settling. The next day, I decided to go for a hike to clear my head. The sounds from the previous night had bothered me, but I didn't want to let my mind get carried away with paranoia. I took a trail through the woods behind the cabin. The trees were tall and thick, the forest floor soft and damp from the previous night's rain. It was beautiful and quiet, just what I needed. But as I walked, I began to notice something strange. The further I went, the more I started to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't a rational feeling, it was more like a gut instinct. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone standing in the shadows behind me. I stopped for a moment, trying to shake off the unease. Maybe it was just the isolation getting to me. The only sound around me was the crunching of leaves underfoot and the occasional bird call. I took a deep breath and started walking again, but the feeling didn't go away. When I returned to the cabin, the unease only deepened. The air seemed heavier, more oppressive. I had expected to be relaxed by the solitude, but instead, I felt increasingly anxious. I didn't want to stay inside the cabin all day, but I didn't want to venture too far into the woods either. There was a strange sense of danger hanging over me, and I couldn't shake it. That evening, as the sun set, I heard the scratching again. This time, it was louder, more persistent. It was coming from the back of the cabin, near the door that led out to the woods. I grabbed the flashlight from the kitchen and stepped outside, my heart pounding in my chest. The wind had died down, and the night was eerily still. I shone the light around the cabin, moving slowly. I checked the door and the windows, but there was no sign of anything. No animals, no broken branches, nothing. My mind raced with possibilities. Maybe there was something under the cabin, something trapped or hiding. But when I knelt down to look underneath, I saw nothing. I felt ridiculous. I stood up, brushing the dirt from my knees, and made my way back inside, locking the door behind me. The scratching continued. I couldn't tell if it was real or just in my head. I started to feel like I was losing touch with reality. Was I imagining things? Was the isolation driving me mad? I spent the rest of the night on edge, every little creak of the house making me jump. I didn't sleep. I just sat in the chair by the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker, the darkness pressing in around me. The following morning, I packed up and decided to leave. I couldn't stay another night in that cabin. But as I gathered my things, something caught my eye. A small object on the floor near the door. It was a tiny piece of wood, no bigger than a matchstick. I picked it up and turned it over in my hand. There was something strange about it. It wasn't part of the cabin, I was sure of that. It wasn't from the furniture or the fireplace. It looked like it had been deliberately placed there. My mind raced again. Had someone been inside the cabin? Was someone messing with me? I quickly checked all the windows and doors. Everything was locked. but still, that piece of wood remained on the floor. I stood there for a moment trying to make sense of it. And then, without warning, I heard the sound again. The scraping noise, louder this time, coming from just outside the cabin door. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. I wasn't alone. I didn't waste another second. I grabbed my bag, shoved the piece of wood into my pocket, and ran out the door, heading down the narrow path toward my car. My pulse was racing, my mind still trying to catch up with what was happening. I didn't care about the rest of my things. I just needed to leave to get away from that cabin. I reached my car and slammed the door shut, my hands shaking as I started the engine. I didn't look back. As I drove away, I felt the tension in my body start to ease, the weight of the place lifting from my shoulders. I didn't go back to that cabin. I don't think I ever will. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But the thing I'll never forget is that piece of wood. It didn't belong there, and I don't think I was alone in that cabin, not for a single moment. It had been a long day of driving when I finally turned onto the narrow dirt road leading to the cabin. I'd rented it for a weekend, hoping to disconnect from everything for a while. No phone signal, no internet, no distractions. Just me, the trees, and the quiet. I'd been craving solitude for a while, so when I found this place tucked away in the woods, about 30 miles outside of town, it seemed perfect. The sky was beginning to turn a pale orange as the sun started setting behind the mountains, casting long shadows over the ground. It was late September, the air crisp and cool but not too cold. The kind of weather where you don't need a jacket but feel comfortable in a sweater. I had been driving for hours already, and though the car had been reliable, it felt like the cabin was getting further and further from civilization with every mile. The road became narrower, winding around sharp bends, and the trees grew thicker on both sides. I glanced at the map again. The GPS had long since stopped working when I lost signal, but according to the paper map I'd printed out, I was on the right track. After about 15 minutes of driving down the dirt road, I saw it, the cabin. It wasn't a large structure, but it stood solid against the backdrop of towering pines. Its wood was weathered but still strong-looking, a mix of deep browns and grays. The porch was empty, save for a few old rocking chairs, and a single light above the door flickered as if it had a mind of its own. A couple of steps led up to the door, which was partially open, probably due to the wind. I parked the car, grabbed my bag from the back, and made my way to the cabin. As soon as my foot hit the first step of the porch, I felt it. The quiet. It was like everything had paused. The sound of the wind through the trees, the rustling of leaves, all seemed muted. I'd expected silence, but this was something different. Something heavy. I shook it off, thinking it was just the isolation, and pushed the door open. Inside was a small living area with a few mismatched chairs, a simple wood stove in the corner, and a wooden coffee table in the middle of the room. A few framed pictures of nature hung on the walls, though the pictures were faded and looked like they'd been there for years. The floorboards creaked under my feet as I dropped my bag by the door. I looked around, taking in the cabin's rustic charm. The place felt old but well-kept, with a cozy atmosphere that made me think of a simpler time. There was a large stone fireplace along one wall, the kind you'd imagine using to cook a hearty meal or curl up in front of with a blanket on a cold night. The kitchen was small but fully stocked with the basics: a stove, a fridge, some pots and pans. I set about unpacking, putting my things away in the small bedroom that led off the main room. There was a large window above the bed, and I could see the forest stretching out beyond. It was beautiful but also a little intimidating. The kind of beauty that makes you feel small, insignificant even, as though the trees might swallow you whole if you weren't careful. By the time I'd unpacked and had a quick dinner, the sun had completely set, leaving the cabin in near darkness. I lit the fire in the stove and settled into the chair by it, the warmth spreading through the room. Outside, the wind picked up, causing the trees to sway gently. There was something calming about the sounds of the forest, but at the same time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't entirely alone. I brushed it off as the typical unease one might feel when alone in a place so far from civilization. But as the night wore on, I began to notice strange things. Small things that didn't quite make sense. A slight creak in the floorboards when I was sure I was the only one moving. A gust of wind rattling the door even though I was certain it had been closed tightly. It was nothing major, just little oddities. But they began to add up. Around 9 p.m., I decided to head outside for a bit of fresh air. The air was cooler now, the kind of chill that makes you pull your sleeves down over your hands. I stepped out onto the porch, the wooden boards creaking under my feet, and looked out at the forest. The trees were swaying more violently now, their branches bending in the wind. It was a strange sensation, like the forest was alive and breathing with me. I turned my attention to the cabin. There was a light in the window. That wasn't right. I was sure I hadn't left any lights on when I came out. The only light in the cabin had been the one by the door, flickering faintly. But now, there was a steady glow coming from one of the windows, casting long shadows against the walls of the cabin. My heart rate picked up. Maybe I had left something on, I reasoned. Maybe the wind had blown the door open. But as I stood there, staring at the light, I began to feel uneasy. I took a few steps back inside, half expecting someone to be standing in the middle of the room, but the cabin was empty. Just the quiet hum of the fire and the soft ticking of an old clock on the wall. I couldn't explain it. I knew I had locked everything up. I checked the windows and doors again, and everything seemed secure. But still, that light. It seemed like something was wrong. I sat back down by the fire, trying to push the thought out of my mind. It was probably nothing. A reflection of the porch light in the window, or the light from the stove making its way into the next room. But as the night went on, I noticed more and more strange things. The creaks in the floorboards became louder, more pronounced. The wind outside started to howl, and the trees groaned under the pressure. I couldn't ignore it any longer. There was something off about this place. I tried to sleep, but the bed felt uncomfortable, the sheets too stiff. Every time I closed my eyes, I could hear something moving outside. The sound of twigs snapping, the rustle of leaves. My mind raced, imagining all sorts of possibilities. Maybe someone else was out there. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. The wind outside seemed to grow louder as the night stretched on. But it wasn't the wind I was listening to. It was the sound of something else. Something moving. Something that wasn't the wind. I heard it again. The sound of twigs snapping, followed by the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the dirt. I got out of bed, my heart pounding in my chest. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer beside the bed and slowly crept to the window. The beam of light flickered across the yard, but there was nothing, just the dark forest surrounding the cabin. I stood there for a long time, my breath shallow, trying to convince myself it was nothing. But something told me that I wasn't alone. Something was watching. The footsteps outside stopped. I waited, tense, listening for any sign of movement. The silence was deafening. Then, the door creaked open slightly, just a hair, as if someone had tried to push it without making noise. I didn't know what to do. My mind raced, but my body was frozen. It was too quiet, too still. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to even think about running. Then the sound of something tapping on the window. It was soft at first, like the brush of a leaf against the glass. But then it became louder, more urgent, like something was trying to get my attention. I couldn't make sense of it. My eyes darted around the room, but there was nowhere to hide. I grabbed the door handle and yanked it shut, locking it quickly. I couldn't explain what was happening, but I felt the presence outside. Something was there. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, everything stopped. The wind died down, and the night became eerily quiet again. The tapping stopped. The footsteps faded into nothing. I waited, my heart hammering in my chest, for what felt like hours before I finally allowed myself to breathe again. The rest of the night passed without incident. I didn't sleep, though. Couldn't. My eyes darted from one corner of the cabin to the next, always searching for something. Couldn't let my guard down. Not after what had happened. When morning finally came, I stepped outside cautiously. The air was crisp and fresh, the sun breaking through the trees, painting everything in golden light. It was as though nothing had happened at all. The cabin was just a cabin. The forest was just a forest. But I knew better. I never did figure out what had happened that night. But I left the cabin the next morning, feeling a sense of relief that I couldn't explain. The drive back was long and quiet, but at least I didn't feel the weight of the unknown pressing on me anymore. I'm not sure what it was. Maybe it was just the isolation playing tricks on my mind. Maybe I had been imagining things. But something tells me that the cabin knew I was there. It was never really mine to begin with, and I'll never go back. The cabin was isolated, tucked deep in the woods of northern Montana, far from the noise of any nearby town. I had rented it for the weekend, needing to get away from the constant buzz of city life. I wasn't exactly a nature person, but I figured a few days of peace and quiet wouldn't hurt. The year was 2023, and I was 32 years old. My name is Ethan, and I was hoping for some solitude, a chance to disconnect and clear my head after a particularly rough few months at work. The drive up to the cabin was long and winding. My car, a well-worn Subaru, had seen better days, but it was holding up. The road became progressively narrower the farther I went, winding around dense trees that seemed to close in on either side. There were no other cars in sight. The only signs of human presence were the occasional trail markers along the way. I passed a few abandoned houses and a couple of small, run-down barns that had clearly been empty for years. By the time I reached the cabin, the sun was starting to dip behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the ground. The cabin itself looked exactly as I had imagined from the pictures. Small, wooden, with a slanted roof and a porch that creaked when I stepped onto it. It looked like a place you'd read about in a book, tucked away in the middle of nowhere. The kind of place people visit to get away from it all. And I had come for that exact reason. I unpacked my car and carried everything inside. The interior was rustic but cozy. The wooden floors creaked underfoot, and the smell of old pine filled the air. There was a stone fireplace against one wall, a small kitchen area to the left, and a couple of worn-out armchairs near the window that overlooked the forest. I set my bags down and explored the cabin for a bit. It was exactly what I needed, a peaceful escape. That first evening, I made myself a simple dinner, something quick since I was tired from the drive. The sound of crackling wood in the fireplace was comforting, the only noise aside from the occasional rustle of the wind outside. I sat in one of the chairs by the window, staring out into the darkening woods, feeling the weight of the silence press in on me. There was something almost oppressive about it, like the woods were alive in a way I couldn't understand. After dinner, I went to bed early, figuring I could use the rest. The bed was surprisingly comfortable, and I soon found myself drifting off, lulled by the quiet and the warmth of the fire. But as the night wore on, something started to disturb the peace. It wasn't anything obvious at first. I woke up once in the middle of the night to the sound of something tapping against the window. It was faint, almost like the branches of a tree were brushing against the glass, but it didn't sit right with me. There were no trees close enough to the cabin to be doing that. I brushed it off as just my mind playing tricks on me. The tapping came again. This time it was louder. I pulled the covers off and swung my legs over the side of the bed, standing up and moving to the window. The moonlight bathed the landscape outside, but there was nothing there. No branches, no animals, no movement at all. Just the trees, still and silent. I didn't know why I had such a strong feeling of unease, but I couldn't shake it. I stood there for a while, staring out into the woods, trying to convince myself that everything was fine. Eventually, I returned to bed, though I didn't sleep well for the rest of the night. The next morning, I decided to go for a hike. Felt like the right thing to do to clear my head. The weather was cool but pleasant, the sun filtering through the trees in soft rays. I took a trail that seemed to wind around a creek. I figured I'd explore a bit before heading back to the cabin. As I walked, I kept hearing faint noises in the distance. Twigs snapping underfoot, leaves rustling. But when I stopped to listen, it would always go quiet. It was starting to get under my skin. I had this growing sense that I wasn't alone in the woods, that someone was out there watching me. Every time I turned around, I half expected to see someone behind me, but there was never anyone there. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just the isolation playing with my nerves. I spent the rest of the day walking around the area, taking in the beauty of the forest, the quiet majesty of it all. But even then, something was nagging at me. A few times, I caught movement from the corner of my eye, just glimpses of shadows darting between trees. But when I turned to look, nothing was there. As the sun began to set again, I made my way back to the cabin, eager to get inside and relax. But as I approached, I noticed something strange. The door to the cabin was slightly ajar. It hadn't been like that when I left, and I was sure I had locked it behind me. I hesitated for a moment before pushing the door open. The inside was just as I had left it. Everything seemed normal, nothing was out of place. But the feeling of unease had intensified. The silence now felt oppressive, like something was waiting, just out of sight. I decided to check the perimeter of the cabin. I stepped outside and circled the building slowly, my eyes scanning the woods around me. Nothing. The trees stood still, the wind barely rustling the leaves. I went back inside, locked the door, and bolted the windows just in case. That night, I didn't bother with the fireplace. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, feeling restless. The tapping started again, this time louder, more insistent. It wasn't the wind. This was something else, something deliberate. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just getting paranoid. But the noise continued, rhythmic and steady, like a slow, deliberate knock. I finally got out of bed and moved toward the window, trying to steady my breath. I pulled back the curtain just enough to peek outside, but there was nothing there. The night was still, the trees unmoving, no one in sight. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and tried to call the cabin owner, but there was no signal out here. I was completely cut off. My heart was racing. The tapping didn't stop. It felt like it was getting closer, moving around the cabin. I sat back down in the chair, pulling my knees up to my chest, trying to breathe deeply. I stayed that way for hours, just listening to the noise. It wouldn't stop. At some point during the night, the tapping stopped. But the silence that followed felt even more unnatural than the noise had. Couldn't sleep, couldn't think. Every creak of the cabin, every distant sound from the woods, set my nerves on edge. When dawn finally came, I was exhausted but determined to leave. I grabbed my things, hastily packed the car, and locked the cabin behind me. The drive back down the winding road was long, and for the first time in days, I felt a sense of relief. The further I got from the cabin, the lighter I felt. As I neared the highway, I glanced at my rearview mirror and saw the faint outline of something in the distance, standing still near the edge of the trees. I didn't stop to investigate. I just kept driving. I would never return to that cabin, and I don't think I'll ever be able to fully explain what happened there. I only know one thing for sure. Sometimes, when you're alone in a place like that, the silence isn't always empty. It was supposed to be a peaceful getaway, a break from the usual noise of city life. The cabin, a small, secluded structure nestled deep in the woods of Oregon, was exactly what I needed. No distractions, no demands, just me and the quiet wilderness. I had found it online, tucked between towering pines and a gentle stream. The listing had promised seclusion, peace, and the perfect escape. I had arrived at the cabin around noon on a crisp October day. The sun was hanging low in the sky, casting long shadows over the forest floor. The air smelled fresh, like earth and pine needles. The road leading to the cabin had been narrow and winding, barely wide enough for my old Subaru. I couldn't help but think how easily I could have missed the turnoff, hidden among the dense trees. The cabin itself was small, made of weathered wood that seemed to blend into the surroundings. It looked old, but sturdy, with a stone chimney and a small porch that wrapped around one side. It had no electricity, no Wi-Fi, no distractions. just the hum of the wind through the trees and the occasional rustling of animals in the underbrush. I liked it. I unloaded my things, bringing in a few bags, a cooler with food, and a backpack full of books. I planned to spend the next few days doing absolutely nothing. I had stocked up on supplies, snacks, canned food, and a couple of bottles of whiskey. It was just me and the forest. That was all I needed. As I stepped inside, the scent of old pine filled the cabin. It was cozy, though a bit dim. There was a fireplace in the center of the room, a sturdy wooden table, and a few mismatched chairs scattered around. The kitchen was simple, just a few shelves and a small wood-burning stove. A couple of windows looked out into the forest, offering a clear view of the trees stretching far into the distance. I could already hear the faint sound of a stream in the distance. After settling in, I spent the afternoon unpacking, stacking some firewood in the corner, and getting familiar with the place. There was a small bathroom off the back, with a wooden tub that had seen better days. The sink had a cracked mirror above it, and the water came from a well outside, which I would need to pump by hand. It wasn't fancy, but it was comfortable enough. By the time evening rolled around, I had lit a fire in the stove, set up a few candles around the room, and opened a book. The cabin felt warm and inviting, despite the creeping chill that had settled outside. I poured myself a drink and watched the flames dance in the fireplace, listening to the occasional crack of the logs as they shifted. Night fell quickly, the forest outside growing darker with each passing minute. I could hear the sounds of animals moving through the brush, but there was nothing unusual, just the natural hum of life in the woods. I finished my drink and decided to turn in early, wanting to wake up to the crisp morning air and start my days of solitude. I slept soundly, the quiet of the cabin wrapping around me like a blanket. There were no city sounds to disturb my sleep. No cars, no honking, no chatter. Just the soft rustle of leaves outside and the faint sound of the stream. It was peaceful. The next morning, I woke to the smell of fresh coffee, the sunlight streaming through the small kitchen window. I got up, stretched, and made my way to the stove. The world outside was still cool, but the sun was climbing in the sky, promising a beautiful day. I took a deep breath and went outside to grab some firewood. The cabin sat at the edge of the forest, and beyond the clearing where it stood, the trees thickened, forming an almost impenetrable wall of green. The woodpile was stacked next to the cabin, and I grabbed a few logs, stacking them on the porch before heading back inside. As I carried the wood, something caught my eye, a trail of broken branches, leading deeper into the forest. It was strange. The trees here were thick and old, the forest dense. There were no signs of any real human presence, except for the faint trail, which looked like someone or something had trampled through. But that didn't make sense. The cabin was supposed to be isolated, far from any other homes or roads. I shook off the feeling of unease, telling myself it was just an animal. After breakfast, I decided to explore a bit. I grabbed my backpack and set off down the trail, curious about where it led. The forest was thick with pine and fir, and the ground was soft underfoot. The sun filtered through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It was quiet, almost too quiet. There was no sign of any animals, no birds chirping, no squirrels scurrying, just silence. The trail wound through the woods, twisting and turning as it followed the contours of the land. I walked for a while, the cool air filling my lungs as I moved deeper into the trees. The further I went, the stranger the forest seemed. The silence was suffocating, and the trees grew closer together, their branches intertwining overhead. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. Eventually, the trail ended at a small clearing. There, in the center of the open space, was a large, old stump. It looked out of place, like it had been there for decades. But what caught my eye wasn't the stump. It was the pile of rocks, neatly arranged in a circle around it. The rocks were placed carefully, as if someone had arranged them deliberately. But why? Who would bother? A chill ran down my spine. The feeling of being watched washed over me, and I turned quickly, scanning the forest behind me. Nothing, just trees and shadows. I took a few steps back, glancing one last time at the clearing before heading back to the cabin. That evening, I tried to shake off the odd feeling I had gotten earlier. I told myself it was just the isolation getting to me, that I was imagining things. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves outside and causing the trees to sway, but nothing unusual. Still, I couldn't help but feel uneasy. It was as if the forest was hiding something I wasn't meant to see. The next day, I decided to leave the cabin behind for a while. I had the feeling that something wasn't right, and I needed to get away for a bit. So, I packed up a small bag with some snacks, my phone, and a flashlight just in case. I wasn't sure where I was going, but I needed to clear my head. I walked along the same trail, trying to put distance between myself and the strange stump and rock circle. The woods seemed even quieter today, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I hiked for hours, not paying much attention to where I was going. I just wanted to be far from that cabin, far from the unsettling feeling that had settled in my chest. But as the sun began to dip lower in the sky, I realized I had wandered much farther than I had intended. I was lost. I didn't panic. I had been hiking before, and I knew that if I retraced my steps, I would eventually find my way back. But the longer I walked, the more the forest seemed to change. The trees were different, the underbrush thicker. And then, just as I thought I recognized a familiar landmark, I heard something. It was faint at first, but then it grew louder, footsteps, soft but deliberate, moving in sync with mine. I stopped dead in my tracks. The footsteps stopped too. I took a slow step forward. The footsteps followed. It wasn't an animal. It wasn't the wind. Someone or something was out there. It was late October, just a few days before Halloween. I'd been feeling the weight of city life pressing down on me for too long, so I decided to get away. I wasn't much of an outdoors person, but something about the idea of a remote cabin in the woods, far from anything, seemed like the perfect escape. I found the place on a small, barely used website. It was cheap, which should have been my first red flag, but at the time I was just looking for somewhere quiet to think. The cabin was located near a small town called Grimsford. The town was barely a blip on the map, not much more than a few scattered homes and a general store. From what I could gather, it had a rich history dating back to the early 1800s, though the cabin itself was only about 40 years old. Still, the idea of a place tucked in the woods with a bit of history to it intrigued me. The cabin was set up on a secluded patch of land surrounded by thick pine trees. The road to it was bumpy, a gravel path with ruts that made my car bounce in the most uncomfortable way. When I finally pulled up, the place looked exactly like I expected. A simple, wooden structure with a porch that creaked under the weight of years. The door was a faded shade of brown. The windows were cracked with age, and the overall feeling of the place was a mix of charm and neglect. I unloaded my things, grabbed a bottle of water from the trunk, and stepped inside. The smell of dust and old wood hit me immediately. The interior was sparse, just a couple of chairs, a small table, and a wood-burning stove. There was a worn-out couch, and the walls were lined with thick wooden beams. The floor was creaky beneath my feet, and I could feel the chill of the air seeping through the thin walls. A large window overlooked the forest, giving me a beautiful yet unsettling view of the dark trees stretching as far as the eye could see. I didn't mind the rustic feel, but the silence was overwhelming. There wasn't a sound, not even a breeze rustling the leaves outside. It was as if the whole world had gone still. After a long drive, I was exhausted, so I tossed my bags onto the couch, made myself some tea, and just sat there for a while, staring out at the woods. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though. The trees, their dark branches twisted in odd directions, seemed to loom a bit too much. The shadows stretched far too long, but I brushed it off, telling myself it was just my imagination. It was too quiet. As evening fell, I lit a fire in the stove. The warmth was a relief against the cool, biting air outside. I made myself dinner, something simple, and ate slowly, taking in my surroundings. Afterward, I grabbed a book off the shelf, but the words blurred in front of my eyes. My mind kept wandering, and my nerves were starting to get to me. I decided to go to bed early. The bed was small, and the blankets smelled faintly of mildew, but it was fine. The night grew colder, and the fire in the stove was dying down. I could hear the crackling of the embers as I tried to drift off to sleep, but the silence outside felt different now. It wasn't just quiet, it was oppressive. The wind outside had picked up, and the trees started to creak and groan. Then I heard it. At first, it was faint, barely noticeable. A soft, scraping sound coming from outside. My mind tried to make sense of it, but there was no logical explanation. I sat up in bed, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I tried to go back to sleep, but the feeling of being watched crept in again, this time even stronger than before. I pulled the covers tighter around me, trying to ignore the feeling in my gut. Suddenly, the scraping noise came again, louder this time. It was as if something was dragging across the wooden porch. My heart skipped a beat. Was it an animal? The thought made me feel foolish, but the sound was too deliberate, too methodical. I got out of bed and grabbed a flashlight. I stood still in the dark room for a long moment, listening. The wind howled outside, but the scraping continued. I hesitated, then made my way to the front door. The moment I touched the handle, I froze. I wasn't sure what I was expecting, but it wasn't this, nothing at all. The porch was empty. I shined the flashlight around, but I couldn't see anything. The door creaked behind me as I swung it back closed. I locked it and stood there for a moment, catching my breath. It was just an animal, I told myself. Probably a raccoon or some small creature dragging something across the porch. But even as I thought that, I knew it didn't feel right. I returned to the bed, trying to sleep again, but I kept hearing things. The wind seemed to pick up, howling louder outside. But then there were those subtle sounds. Scratching at the windows, a soft tap 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 at the door. I tried to tell myself it was just the storm, the trees, or maybe even the house settling, but deep down I wasn't convinced. Felt wrong. I barely slept that night. The next morning, I woke up feeling groggy and restless, the shadows of last night still fresh in my mind. The sun had risen, but the sky was overcast, a thick layer of clouds hanging low above. I decided to take a walk to clear my head. The woods were still eerily quiet, and I couldn't shake the sense that something was just out of sight, something watching me. I walked for an hour, taking in the fresh air and trying to ignore the knots in my stomach. Eventually, I stumbled across a small clearing, and in the center of it was something unexpected. An old, rusted car. The car was half buried in the undergrowth, its body faded and scratched by years of exposure. It had clearly been here for decades. I approached it cautiously, examining the broken windows and peeling paint. I wasn't sure why it unsettled me, but it did. It was as if it shouldn't be here. Something about it didn't belong. I pulled my eyes away and turned to head back to the cabin, but then I heard something. A snap of a twig, followed by a soft crunch of leaves. My blood ran cold. I froze, listening. Nothing, just the wind. I hurried back to the cabin. My nerves were shot and I didn't feel like sticking around much longer. I packed my things, ready to leave the cabin and the odd, unsettling feeling behind. But as I was loading my car, I saw something strange. A shadow moving in the trees, just beyond the line of sight. I turned to look, but whatever it was had disappeared. I got in the car and drove off without a second thought. The whole experience felt like a blur, a nightmare that I couldn't shake off no matter how hard I tried. And as I drove away, I realized just how quiet it had gotten again. Too quiet. When I returned home, I tried to put the experience out of my mind, but the memory of that odd, rusted car and the strange, scraping noises kept haunting me. It wasn't until months later, when I came across an old newspaper article about Grimsford's history, that I learned the truth. The article talked about a man who had gone missing from that area years ago. His car had been found abandoned in the woods, just a few miles from the cabin. No one had ever found him. They speculated he had gotten lost or had an accident, but the search turned up nothing. The more I thought about it, the more I realized that the scraping sounds on the porch, the shadow in the woods, it all made sense now. That man, who had disappeared without a trace, had likely been out there in the woods, just like I had. Only he hadn't made it out. It was late October when I found myself heading to that cabin in the middle of nowhere. I had been searching for some time for a remote place where I could get away from the noise of everyday life. Life in the city had been weighing on me. Too many people, too much traffic, the constant hum of a place that never seemed to rest. I was looking for silence, and a small cabin located deep in the woods seemed like the perfect escape. I rented the cabin online, not asking too many questions. The website description seemed basic, but the pictures looked idyllic. Wooden walls, a fireplace, and views of thick forest as far as the eye could see. It had been a month of vacation, and the thought of spending the days hiking, reading, and reflecting on life seemed like just what I needed. I was in my early 30s, named Tom, and I had been living in Portland, Oregon for a few years. The cabin was located about 2 hours outside of town, somewhere along the Columbia River Gorge, far from any other houses or roads. The place had been rented out by a guy named Jack, who was apparently the caretaker, but he lived an hour away, so I'd be alone for most of my stay. The weather had already turned cool, and the trees were shedding their leaves, blanketing the forest floor in an endless array of golds and reds. As I drove toward the cabin, the air felt heavy with the scent of pine and damp earth. The further I drove, the less civilization I saw. It was just winding roads, dense woods, and the occasional wildlife darting across the road. It was beautiful, but a bit isolating. By the time I arrived at the cabin, dusk had already started to set in. I parked my car in front of a small wooden structure, and it looked just like the pictures, maybe even better. The cabin had a rustic charm to it, with its steep roof and large stone chimney. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, looking around. There were no other cabins in sight, no roads, no people, just wilderness. I opened the door with the key Jack had left for me under the welcome mat. The door creaked loudly as it opened, and the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was inside. The kind of silence that felt almost thick, like the sound of the world itself had been swallowed by the trees. The cabin was cozy, small but functional. It had an old-fashioned wood stove in the corner, a sturdy-looking wooden table, and a sofa covered in plaid fabric. The kitchen was basic, just a stove, fridge, and sink, but the windows offered a perfect view of the forest outside. It was exactly what I had wanted. I spent the next hour unpacking, setting my things in the bedroom, and starting a fire in the stove. The warmth from the fire spread through the cabin, making the air feel thick with comfort. I had planned to just relax that evening. Maybe read a book, have some dinner, and just enjoy the solitude. I didn't have much of an agenda except to enjoy the peace. As night fell, I noticed something strange. There was no noise. No noise at all. Usually, even in the woods, you'd hear something, the occasional bird, the wind rustling through the trees, maybe even an animal in the distance. But here it was dead silent. No rustling leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. I shook it off, figuring it was just how remote the cabin was. After all, I was a couple hours outside of town, and the forest was thick. Maybe there wasn't much wildlife nearby, or they were all just huddled in their dens for the night. But then, around 9 p.m., I heard a noise. It was faint at first, like a tap, tap, tap on the wooden side of the cabin. I stood still, holding my breath, listening carefully. The sound was irregular, almost like something was gently knocking on the wood. I looked out the window. Nothing. I tried to ignore it, but the tapping continued for a while, always in the same rhythm. After about 15 minutes, it stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right, though. The cabin felt even more isolated now, and I found myself checking the locks on the doors and windows just to reassure myself. I managed to sleep that night, though fitfully. The wind howled around the cabin, and I thought I heard the tapping again at some point, but by the time I would have gotten up to check, it was gone. The next day, I decided to get out and explore. I grabbed my backpack, threw on my boots, and set off into the forest. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched beneath my feet as I made my way through the trees. The silence was still present, but it didn't feel as oppressive now. I walked for hours, not seeing a single soul. The trees were so thick in places that it felt like I was walking through an endless maze. By mid-afternoon, I decided to head back to the cabin. When I arrived, I felt a small wave of relief wash over me. The cabin was exactly how I had left it. No signs of tampering, nothing unusual. That night, the tapping started again. This time, I couldn't ignore it. It was louder now, more insistent. Tap, 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 like someone was trying to get my attention. I got up, grabbed a flashlight, and opened the door. I scanned the area with the beam of light, but there was nothing. No one in sight. The forest was still and dark. I closed the door and locked it, my heart pounding in my chest. The tapping didn't stop, though. It went on for what felt like hours. I was on edge, not knowing whether I should leave or wait it out. I didn't want to confront whatever was out there, but the silence was starting to feel more threatening than comforting. I decided to call Jack. He didn't answer. I left a voicemail, not really expecting a response. The tapping stopped around midnight, and I managed to fall asleep despite my nerves. The following day, I made sure everything was secure before I left. The tapping had stopped, but there was still a lingering unease in the back of my mind. I didn't know what had caused it, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been watching me. It was irrational, I knew that, but I couldn't help it. I didn't go back into the woods after that. Instead, I stayed close to the cabin, reading by the fire and trying to distract myself. It wasn't until the third night, when the tapping started again, that I realized I wasn't alone. This time, the tapping was accompanied by something else. Footsteps. Slow, deliberate, as if someone was pacing around the cabin. I held my breath and listened, feeling the weight of the silence pressing down on me. The footsteps stopped for a moment, and then I heard something scrape along the side of the cabin, like something heavy dragging along the wood. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my phone and dialed 911. The operator answered quickly, and I told her my situation. I was given a reference number, but no help was immediately available. I didn't want to wait. I felt the need to leave, to run. I grabbed my things and bolted out the door, making sure to lock it behind me. The night air was cold, and the moon was hidden behind thick clouds. I ran to my car, adrenaline pumping, and drove off as fast as I could. The feeling of being watched didn't leave me until I reached the nearest town, hours later. When I finally stopped and checked my phone, I had a message from Jack. He apologized for not answering my calls, saying he had been in town. He didn't mention anything about the noises, but he offered to refund me for the remainder of my stay if I wasn't comfortable. I never went back to that cabin. In fact, I never went back into the woods at all. The peace I had been looking for came at a cost I wasn't prepared to pay. The isolation, the silence, and the strange noises. It was too much. The memory of those footsteps, the scraping sound, and the feeling that I wasn't alone lingered with me long after I left. But I did leave, and that's what mattered. I didn't need to confront whatever it was that had been out there. I learned something in those few days, that sometimes the most important thing is knowing when to walk away. The drive up to the cabin was longer than I expected. It wasn't the kind of place you could easily get to. Even though my GPS kept insisting that I was getting closer, the roads seemed to twist and bend further into the woods. The further I drove, the fewer signs of civilization there were. I hadn't seen another car in the last 20 minutes. Not a soul in sight. I had rented the cabin for a weekend getaway, something to disconnect from the chaos of the city. The place was supposed to be peaceful, surrounded by trees and nature, tucked away in a small mountain town in northern Idaho. I was looking forward to the silence, a break from everything that had been weighing on me for the past few months. But as I turned onto the last stretch of road leading to the cabin, something about the place felt off. I couldn't put my finger on it exactly, but the stillness in the air was unsettling. When I finally pulled up to the cabin, I was relieved to see it standing there, an old wooden structure with a small porch and a few windows. It looked exactly like the photos. The woods around it were thick, casting long shadows, but the cabin itself seemed sturdy enough, tucked back between a couple of tall pines. The sun had just started to dip below the horizon, and there was a faint chill in the air that made me zip up my jacket as I grabbed my bags from the car. The cabin was locked, but there was a key hidden under the doormat, just like the owner had said. I stepped inside, the wooden floors creaking under my weight. The place smelled like pine and dust, and the faint scent of something else, something old. The living room had a couch, a fireplace, and a small dining table. There was a kitchen off to one side, and a staircase that led up to the second floor. The entire place had that weathered charm, like it hadn't been touched in years, but there was something comforting about it, too. The crackling of the fire would be enough to warm the place up, I thought. Maybe a good book, some hot coffee, and I'd finally be able to relax. I settled in, unpacking my things and lighting the fire. The warmth quickly spread, and I could already feel the tension in my shoulders begin to loosen. I sat down on the couch and stared out the window, watching as the trees swayed gently in the evening breeze. It was peaceful, quiet. I felt like I could finally breathe. But then I heard something, a soft noise coming from upstairs. I froze. I wasn't imagining it. It was a light thump, almost like someone, had shifted upstairs. I wasn't sure if I should investigate or ignore it. Could be nothing, right? Maybe it was just the house settling, old wood creaking under the weight of time. That was probably all it was. But the sound came again. Another thump. This time it sounded like footsteps. I stood up and slowly made my way to the bottom of the stairs. I felt silly now, wondering if maybe I had just heard something outside and let my mind run wild. I wasn't used to being alone in places like this, and maybe that was all it was. A trick of the mind. I called out, "Hello!" Nothing. I took a step forward, my heart beating a little faster than usual. I knew I had rented the cabin by myself, but the thought that there might be someone else here made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Slowly, I climbed the stairs, each step creaking under my weight. The landing at the top of the stairs was dimly lit by a small light, and it led into two rooms. I could hear the faint sound of something shuffling inside one of them. I took a deep breath and reached for the door handle of the room where the noise had come from. Then, without warning, the door creaked open on its own. My heart skipped a beat. I stood frozen in the doorway, staring at the room. It was just a simple bedroom, a bed covered in an old quilt, a small dresser, and a nightstand. The window was slightly open, letting in a cool breeze, but there was no sign of anyone or anything inside. The room was empty. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Why had the door opened by itself? Why did it feel like I wasn't alone, even though the cabin seemed deserted? I closed the door behind me and made my way back downstairs, trying to push the unease from my mind. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that everything was fine, but I couldn't help it. Every creak of the floorboards made me jump. Every shadow seemed darker than it should be. I tried to focus on the fire, but the crackling of the logs just felt too loud, too overwhelming. The night was long. I managed to get some sleep, though it wasn't the peaceful rest I had hoped for. I kept waking up, the feeling of being watched lingering, like something was just beyond the reach of my awareness. The next morning, I woke up to the sound of birds chirping outside. It was bright, and the sunlight streaming through the window made everything look less ominous. I decided to go for a walk to clear my head, to remind myself that there was nothing to be afraid of. The woods were beautiful, the trees tall and dense, the air fresh and clean. I spent hours walking along the trails that wound through the forest, trying to shake off the tension from the night before. When I returned to the cabin, the door was slightly ajar. That was odd. I was sure I had closed it before leaving. My pulse quickened as I approached, cautiously stepping inside. The smell of something cooking lingered in the air, something warm, like stew or soup. But I was alone. There was no one else in sight. I stood in the entryway, trying to decide whether I should go check the kitchen or leave. The feeling of dread was back, stronger now. I wanted to leave, but something told me to stay, to see this through. I turned to the kitchen. The stove was on. The pot on it was bubbling, the steam rising from it. But no one was there. I shut the stove off, staring at the pot for a long time, trying to make sense of what was happening. How had it gotten turned on? Had someone been in here? I checked the rest of the cabin. Everything was as it had been before I left. No sign of forced entry, no evidence that anyone had been there at all. But that smell lingered. The warmth of the food. The fire crackled in the corner of the living room, as if nothing was amiss. I knew I couldn't stay another night. This was no longer a simple getaway. It was something else, something I couldn't explain. But as I turned to grab my things, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. The door to the room upstairs, the one I had checked earlier, was open. Not just a little, but wide open. I was certain I had closed it before. I stood there, my mind racing. I should have left. I should have gone home hours ago. But my feet felt glued to the floor, my body frozen in place. I had to know. I had to see what was in that room. I climbed the stairs again, my legs heavy, each step feeling like it took twice as long as before. The door to the room creaked open with a groan. The room was still empty, but something was different this time. On the floor, in the corner, was a small piece of paper, folded in half. I picked it up carefully, afraid of what it might say. It was a note, a single line of writing. "Leave now, or you'll never leave." The words sent a chill through my body. I stood there, holding the note in my trembling hands, trying to make sense of it. But there was nothing more. No explanation, no context. I didn't waste any more time. I packed up my things, threw them into the car, and drove off as fast as I could. The forest seemed to stretch endlessly in all directions, but I didn't stop until I was back in town. I never went back to that cabin. To this day, I still can't explain what happened or why it happened. But I know one thing for sure. Some places should remain undisturbed, and some things should never be explored. I had never been the type to get scared easily. The idea of spending time alone in a cabin in the middle of nowhere sounded peaceful, a way to disconnect from the noise of life. So when I saw an ad for a secluded cabin rental deep in the woods of northern Michigan, I jumped at the chance. The cabin was small, with a wooden exterior and a stone chimney, surrounded by tall pines and thick underbrush. It seemed like the perfect place to unwind, reflect, and enjoy some solitude. I had been through worse, camping in the Adirondacks, hiking in the Rockies, surviving some incredibly uncomfortable nights with little more than a tent and a fire. I thought I was used to being alone in nature, but this was different. I arrived in the early evening, just as the sun dipped below the treeline, casting long shadows across the path that led up to the cabin. There was no one around, just the sounds of the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird call. The air was cool but not cold, and the smell of pine and damp earth filled my lungs. The cabin was just as described, rustic and charming, tucked away in its own little corner of the woods. I unloaded my bags, setting up inside. The interior was simple, nothing fancy. A stone fireplace on one wall, a small kitchen with old-fashioned appliances, and a couple of worn armchairs near the window. A large wooden table took up most of the center of the room, and the only bedroom was tucked behind a small hallway. I thought I could get used to this. That first night was quiet. Too quiet in hindsight. The sound of the wind outside was constant, whispering through the trees. I stoked the fire, made a simple meal, and settled in for the night with a book. I wasn't expecting anything unusual, but as the night wore on, the silence seemed heavier. It wasn't the kind of peaceful quiet I was used to. It felt almost oppressive. I tried to ignore it, but every now and then, I'd hear a faint crack, like something shifting in the woods, a twig breaking, or perhaps a stone being moved. It was subtle, easy to dismiss as the wind or the settling of the cabin, but the noises grew louder as the hours passed. I convinced myself it was just the house. Houses creak, after all. Trees rub against walls. Nothing to be concerned about. But then, just after midnight, I heard a sound that made me pause. It wasn't the wind. It was a scraping, like something was being dragged across the ground. Slowly, methodically, I froze, my heart pounding. My first instinct was to get up and check, but a strange sense of dread washed over me. It felt like something was out there, something aware of me. I stayed still, listening as the sound faded away into the distance. Sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I drifted off, I was jolted awake by the slightest noise. The wind howling, the distant rustle of trees, But this time, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The next morning, I forced myself to forget about the noises. Maybe it had been an animal. Something large, maybe a deer, dragging its feet through the underbrush. I went outside to explore the area around the cabin, hoping to clear my head. The woods were thick with trees, the ground soft and spongy from the previous night's rain. I followed a narrow trail that wound deeper into the forest. There was a sense of peace here, but also something unsettling. It felt as though I was being watched, though I couldn't see anyone. I walked for about an hour before turning back, realizing I had gone farther than I intended. When I returned to the cabin, I noticed something odd. There were footprints in the dirt right by the front door. They weren't mine. They weren't animal tracks either. They were too large, too human, but the prints were uneven, like someone had been dragging their feet. I stepped back, feeling a shiver run down my spine. I had locked the door when I arrived, and the windows were secure. So how could someone have gotten so close without me hearing them? I spent the rest of the afternoon inside, unsure of what to do. The quiet of the cabin felt almost suffocating now. I kept thinking back to the strange noises I had heard the previous night. The dragging sound. It didn't make sense. That night, I locked every door and window, making sure everything was secure before heading to bed. As I lay there in the dark, I kept my mind busy, thinking about anything other than the strange events. But then the sound returned. This time it was louder, closer. The scraping of something against the ground. I sat up, my heart racing. I didn't want to look, didn't want to confirm what I feared, but my curiosity got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and crept to the window, peering out into the darkness. There, just beyond the tree line, I saw movement. Something tall and thin, moving slowly through the underbrush. It didn't look right. The figure paused for a moment, then continued, dragging something behind it. I couldn't make out details, but there was something horribly wrong about the way it moved. My breath caught in my throat. I backed away from the window, panic starting to rise in my chest. I had to get out of there. I grabbed my keys, planning to leave, but then I remembered. The car. I had parked it in a small clearing down the road, and the only way to get there was past the figure. My options were limited. I spent the next hour pacing, waiting for the figure to leave or the night to pass. But it didn't. The sounds outside grew louder, closer. The figure was still out there, moving in circles around the cabin. I had no choice. I had to leave. I gathered my things and snuck out the back door, trying not to make a sound. My heart was pounding in my chest as I made my way toward the clearing, praying I wouldn't be seen. But when I reached the edge of the woods, I froze. The figure was standing at the edge of the clearing, facing me. I couldn't see its face, but I could feel its gaze on me. Something in its stance made my blood run cold. Its posture was unnatural, twisted. I wanted to scream, to run, but I was frozen in place, rooted to the spot. It didn't move. It just stood there, staring at me. I don't know how long I stood there, caught in that moment of terror. But eventually, the figure turned and walked back into the trees, disappearing into the night. I didn't wait. I ran to my car, got in, and drove as fast as I could, my hands shaking on the wheel. I didn't stop until I reached the nearest town. The cabin was miles behind me, and I had no intention of going back. Looking back on it now, I'm not sure what I saw that night. I never found out who or what it was. But I do know one thing: I was lucky to get out. I had always thought of myself as someone who could handle the quiet. That's why, when I saw the opportunity to spend a weekend alone in a cabin in the woods, I jumped at the chance. It seemed like the perfect getaway, away from the noise of the city, the endless work emails, and the constant hum of daily life. The place was tucked away in the middle of a dense forest, somewhere in the mountains of northern Vermont. The cabin, an old log structure with creaky floors and a stone fireplace, looked like the kind of place that had been standing for decades. I'd seen pictures of it online, and it seemed charming. It felt like a good place to disconnect, read some books, maybe do a little fishing by the nearby lake. It wasn't far from civilization, just a short drive, but far enough that there would be no distractions. I was 28, still young enough to seek peace in solitude, but not so naive to think there wouldn't be a little unease being alone in the middle of nowhere. When I arrived, the sun had just started to dip below the horizon. The shadows in the forest stretched longer as I unloaded my bags from the car. The cabin's porch was old, with peeling paint and a few rickety chairs that squeaked when you sat down. It looked abandoned at first glance, but as I stepped inside, I could tell it had been kept up over the years, if not by the owner, then by whoever took care of it before me. The inside was cozy, a couch by the fireplace, a small kitchen with basic amenities, and a tiny bathroom. A large window looked out into the dense trees. Perfect. I'd planned on making a small fire that evening to ward off the chilly air that had started to creep in as the sun sank lower. I spent the evening unpacking, getting the fire going, and cooking a simple dinner, nothing fancy, just pasta with some Jared sauce and a side of bread. It was peaceful. The sound of the crackling fire, the rustling of the wind outside, and the occasional creak of the cabin were the only noises I could hear. No phone calls, no emails, just me and the world outside. I turned off my phone and left it charging in the bedroom. Night fully settled in, and I sat in front of the fire, reading a book I'd brought with me. It wasn't long before I felt the drowsiness begin to take over. I decided to head to bed, stoking the fire one last time before slipping under the covers. I don't know what woke me up, but something jolted me from my sleep. I lay there for a moment, trying to remember where I was, my eyes adjusting to the dark. The cabin was quiet. The fire had burned out, leaving only faint embers glowing in the hearth. I looked out the window. The moonlight barely filtered through the trees, casting long shadows over the landscape. For a moment, everything felt normal, but then I heard it, a soft thud, then another. I froze. The sound was coming from outside the cabin. At first, I thought it could be an animal, a raccoon, maybe, or a deer. The sounds came again, a little louder this time, and closer. Thud, thud, like something heavy was moving in the woods. I lay still, listening, trying to discern the source of the noise. It wasn't the usual rustling of leaves or the squeak of a branch. This was deliberate. My heart started to race. I couldn't tell if I was being paranoid or if something was actually out there. I forced myself to get up and tiptoed to the window, my bare feet feeling cold on the wood floor. I peered outside but saw nothing, just the dark trees, the occasional flutter of a bird, and the faint glint of moonlight off the wet ground. Still, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to be hearing things. Maybe it was just an animal. I didn't think too much of it, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I went back to bed, but sleep wouldn't come easily. The thudding noises had stopped, but a sense of unease settled over me. My mind kept replaying the noise, trying to make sense of it, trying to figure out if I was overreacting. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the smell of damp earth. I stretched, feeling the tension of the night's paranoia still clinging to me. I was determined to not let it ruin my trip. I spent the day exploring the area around the cabin. The woods were thick, the trails were narrow, and everything felt remote. I found the lake a couple of miles down the trail, its surface still and quiet. There was a small dock, but no one else was around. It was peaceful in a way that felt almost too perfect. As the afternoon wore on, I felt myself beginning to relax. The unsettling noises from the night before seemed like a distant memory. That night, I made another fire, cooked a simple meal, and read for a while. The cabin felt warm and safe again, the quiet welcoming. I thought maybe it had just been my imagination running wild, stirred by the isolation. There was no way that whatever had made that noise could still be out there. The night passed without incident. The next morning, I woke early, as usual, to the sound of birds chirping outside. I had a light breakfast and decided to go for another walk. I wasn't sure why, but I felt drawn to a certain spot further into the woods, a little farther than I had gone the day before. I didn't bring my phone or anything with me, just a sense of curiosity that pulled me onward. I followed the trail deeper, the trees growing thicker and the path harder to see. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, But as I drew closer, I realized that there was something in the dirt. A patch of soil had been disturbed, and there were large, deep tracks leading into the woods. They were unlike any animal tracks I'd seen before, large, heavy, almost human-like, but not quite. The footprints led deeper into the woods, and for a moment, I hesitated. I considered turning back, but something told me to keep going to see where they led. The tracks stopped at the base of a large tree. There was nothing else around, no sign of an animal or a person, just the tree and the disturbed earth. But something about it made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. I backed away slowly, my thoughts racing. Who or what had been out here? I didn't want to panic, but the sense of being watched returned. I turned and made my way back to the cabin. Faster now. I didn't feel safe out there anymore, not after what I'd seen. I locked the door behind me and sat by the fire, trying to calm myself down. That night, I stayed close to the cabin. The fire blazed bright and steady, but every creak of the wood and every gust of wind had me on edge. The thudding noise from the first night came back, but this time it was louder. It felt closer, like something or someone was just outside. I grabbed a kitchen knife from the drawer, not sure why, but it made me feel a little better. The noise grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside the window. I held my breath, the knife trembling in my hand. And then, everything went quiet. The silence stretched on, thick and suffocating. After what felt like an eternity, I crept to the window again, my heart hammering in my chest. The moon was high in the sky, casting everything in an eerie light, but there was nothing. No figure, no shadow, just the empty forest. I don't know how long I stood there, staring into the night, but when I finally turned away, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I packed my things quickly and left the cabin at first light, the unease I'd felt the past few days crawling under my skin. The drive home felt endless, but as soon as I crossed the line back into the town, I could finally breathe again. I never found out what was out there in the woods or who had made those tracks. Maybe it was just an animal, maybe it wasn't. But that night in that cabin, I knew one thing for sure: I wouldn't be returning, and I was perfectly fine with that.